Chapter 91. The night was dim and the mountain breeze was gentle. Although it was a bit chilly, for some reason, it was no longer as gloomy as before. Instead, there was some warmth. Perhaps people were like this. As long as someone was with them, they would feel better. Loneliness was the deepest fear in the bottom of their hearts. Therefore, after a moment of silence, Xian finally told Lu Chen what had happened during this period of time. After returning to Kunwu City from the Land of Chaos, the Yi family, who were anxious because she had secretly left home, was naturally overjoyed. Although they scolded her a few times, they were glad that nothing serious had happened. However, there were 3 people who had left, but only one person was left when they returned. Moreover, the other 2 were genuine Kunlun disciples. Of course, this matter couldn't be easily brushed aside. Soon, someone from the Kunlun party came down to inquire about this matter. Xian truthfully told them what happened on Black Armor Mountain. At first, everyone sighed with emotion and didn't think too much about it. Even He Gang's elder brother, senior martial brother He Yi, who was well known in the Kunlun party, came over. In the end, he also left in silence and didn't make things difficult for Xian. No one believed that a little girl like Xian, who hadn't even formally entered the Kunlun party, would have the intention or ability to harm those 2 people. The following days were peaceful for a period of time. Soon, it was time for the Kunlun party's immortal appraisal assembly. At this time, a message from Jean Dan Friar, who had taken a liking to Xian, came from Kunlun Mountain. The gist of the message was that Dongfang Tao, a Taoist expert, had suffered more serious injuries than expected. He still had to go into closed-door meditation for a period of time, and it was unknown when he would come out. However, Xian was already of age. If she didn't go up the mountain to learn martial arts, she would probably be delayed. Therefore, according to Dongfang Tao's arrangements, the Yi family sent Xian to Kunlun and she successfully entered a sect. In the end, Dongfang Tao arranged for her to become an official disciple in Baichao Tang. Speaking of which, the status of an official disciple was much higher than that of a servant disciple. An official disciple only needed to cultivate and did not need to do any work to obtain cultivation resources. Of course, the prerequisite for such treatment was that one had to be talented enough and have a strong background. In short, up to this point, Xian had been living a good life. She was full of hope for the future, happily cultivating on Kunlun Mountain with peace of mind. But a month later, the situation suddenly changed. He Gang, one of the 3 from that day, actually returned. According to him, he was surrounded by a pack of terrifying black jackals and crazily gnawed on him. Later, he accidentally fell off a cliff and happened to fall into a pool of water below. That was how he managed to escape. Even so, He Gang still suffered greatly. Not only was his handsome face completely ruined, his vitality was also greatly damaged. His cultivation was mostly gone and there were many serious injuries on his body. When he was discovered at the foot of Kunlun Mountain, he was already on the verge of death. No one knew how he managed to make it back. Fortunately, he had a powerful brother, who loved him dearly. When he found out about this, he immediately tried his best and used many good medicines and miraculous pills to save him. He even recovered most of his cultivation, which was a great fortune amidst the misfortune. But from then on, He Gang seemed to have suddenly changed into a different person, perhaps because he had received too much stimulation in the Land of Chaos. His personality was abnormally extreme, and he often quarreled and provoked others. Others, on account of his pitiful experience and He Yi's face, would usually give him some leeway. Then, He Gang discovered Xian, who was also on Kunlun Mountain. It was hard to imagine what He Gang was thinking when he saw Xian. But Xian was very surprised at first. Although she was a little afraid when she saw He Gang's terrifying face, she was still happy that he had survived. But He Gang's reaction was beyond Xian's expectation. When he saw Xian, he was stunned for a long time before he stepped back. But soon, he suddenly rushed over with a roar, grabbed Xian's hand, and asked the 2 of them to become cultivation companions. Then, he began to grope her. Xian was scared out of her wits. Needless to say, she resisted with all her might. After she finally escaped, she soon heard that He Gang was spreading rumors in the Kunlun party. He said that when they went south to the land of chaos, the two of them were already in love and had privately pledged to marry each other. It was also because he was deeply in love with the Exen that he gang had risked his life to distract all the dogs when they encountered the terrifying pack of black jackals on the Black Armor Mountain, so that Exen could escape alone and he would be doomed eternally. But now, when Xian saw that his cultivation was damaged, especially his face, she actually turned her back on him. When she heard this, Xian was completely dumbfounded. And things took a turn for the worse, especially when Gang's elder brother, felt sorry for his younger brother's misfortune and publicly said that Xian was ungrateful. For a while, there were many discussions about this matter in the Kunlun sect. Even if Xian tried her best to explain that the situation was not like that at that time, not many people openly expressed sympathy for her. At the same time, Gang became even more entangled with her. He came to harass her every 2 or 3 days, and insisted that she become cultivation companions with him. The scene that Lu Chen saw at the edge of the forest in Shirpan Valley during the day was the scene that had been repeated in the past few days. Hearing this, Lu Chen finally understood and did not speak for a while. It was quiet inside and outside the mountain pavilion at this moment, only the light sound of the wind could be heard. Exen quietly looked up at Lu Chen, but found that sitting across the table he was looking at her with a pair of bright eyes, and the expression in his eyes was a little strange. "Brother Lu, why are you looking at me like that?" For some reason, Exen suddenly felt a little guilty and carefully asked. Lu Chen looked at her, thought for a while and asked, "Before I met you, there was really nothing between you and Gang, right?" "No, really." Exen suddenly stood up, looking anxious, and loudly said, "Brother Lu, I swear to the heavens, there is absolutely no love affair between me and senior martial brother He. At that time, I only thought of him as an older brother, and followed him and martial Uncle Han to gain experience." Lu Chen nodded, indicating for her to calm down. Then he muttered to himself for a while and said, "This matter is not a big deal. Not to mention spiritual master Yuaning, even the sect's Jin Dan Friar would be too lazy to care. Oh, speaking of which, don't you also have a backer? Ask your master Dongfang Tao to come out and say something. Although that He's prospects are good, but as far as I know, Dongfang Tao is a veteran Jin Dan friar, and has achieved Jin Dan for at least 10 years. With this kind of experience, many people would have to give him face." Xian's face was sullen, and her expression was full of grievance. She said, "Master Dongfeng, his injuries are not light. That day, after arranging for me to enter the sect, he went into seclusion again. He only said that after he came out, he would perform the ceremony of becoming my disciple. Before that, he first let me follow Bai Chao Tang to practice some basic techniques. I really have no choice." Lu Chen was startled, shook his head, and quietly said to himself, "This old man is a good hands-off shopkeeper. Why do I feel that he is quite similar to that damn Baldy?" Chapter 92. Xian didn't hear him clearly. She asked, "Brother Lu, what did you say?" "Nothing." Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "Did you tell your family? Your clan can be considered an aristocratic family in Kunwa City. After so many years, you must have a good relationship with the Kunlun party. Could you ask your elders to find someone to talk to you?" Exen smiled bitterly and said, "I did. My family also asked someone to speak on my behalf, but..." Her voice became gloomy and she said softly, "Our clan's current situation is just so. Xian didn't say anything else and Lu Chen didn't continue asking. Some principles had been the same since ancient times. Even if the world changed, it was still very difficult to change. Perhaps the clan had produced outstanding talents a long time ago and passed down the clan's foundation, but the world was very realistic. Now that you were weak, your voice naturally wouldn't be loud enough. Even friendships would slowly fade with the passage of time. A powerful Jin Dan friar was enough to establish a clan that could be passed down for generations. He was such a genius that everyone thought highly of. They believed that he would definitely become Jin Dan in the future. Many people even believed that he might have a chance to become the incomparably powerful Master Yuaning. With the existence of such a figure, It was obviously not worth it for those who were not interested in fighting against him for an ordinary family that had nothing to do with them. What's more, from the beginning to the end, he had never stepped forward to make things difficult for Exin. It was just that his brother admired the girl, so he pursued her wholeheartedly. It wasn't a matter of fighting and killing, so how could he intervene? This matter seems quite troublesome. Lu Chen sighed softly and said to Exin. Exin wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and said, Brother Lu, since you're so powerful, can you help me? Lu Chen looked at Exin and saw that she was sitting there looking at him with eyes full of expectation. After a while, Lu Chen suddenly smiled and said, Why should I help you? What's in it for me? Exin was stunned as if she didn't expect Lu Chen to suddenly say something like this. After a while, she stammered, This, Brother Lu? No, I don't know. I think you're a good person and you treat me very well. I thought you'd help me. Lu Chen laughed involuntarily and said, Who told you that I'm a good person? You're too simple-minded. No wonder you're being forced. Exion's face was bitter as if she didn't know what to say. In the end, she could only mumble, I just thought that Brother Lu helped me when we were in the disorienting lands, so I think you're a good person. Tisk. Lu Chen was speechless for a moment. He shook his head and thought for a while before saying, In any case, I'm not the kind of person you think I am. I can't work for free. If you want me to help you solve this matter, you'll have to pay me something. Oh, that's what I should do, Exin said repeatedly. Brother Lu, what do you want? As long as I have it, I'll give it to you. Looking at her anxious expression, it was obvious that she wanted nothing more than to get rid of He Gang's entanglement. It was obvious that she was about to go crazy. If that's the case, then repay me with your body, Lu Chen said. Exin was instantly dumbstruck. Her mouth was wide open as if she had turned into a stone. After a moment, she suddenly saw a faint smile hanging on the corner of Lu Chen's mouth. Only then did she suddenly come back to her senses. She stomped her feet in embarrassment and anger, and said angrily, Big Brother Lu, what are you doing? Lu Chen smiled and said, What's wrong? You can't take it after just one sentence? Lu Chen said, I saw that when He Gang came to pester you, you looked embarrassed, angry, and panic-stricken from beginning to end. You didn't even have the strength to fight back. Are your feelings then the same as now? Exin seemed to understand, but her cheeks still felt a little hot. She said in a low voice, More or less. Lu Chen sneered with a bit of undisguised mockery. Exin suddenly felt that her face was even hotter. Then she heard Lu Chen say, I'll help you with this matter, but I haven't thought about what the reward will be. I'll owe you for now. Just remember to help me with this matter in the future. Hearing Lu Chen's words, Exin suddenly felt that she had seen a ray of light in the darkness. She hurriedly agreed and then looked at Lu Chen with a face full of expectation, as if she had seen an omnipotent god. Her gaze was so hot that even a thick-skinned person like Lu Chen couldn't bear it. He glared at her and then said, I've thought about this matter from beginning to end. I think your biggest problem now is that you have no way to ask for help. If your Jin Dan stage master comes out, maybe you won't be in such a difficult situation? Exin said without hesitation, Of course, Master Dongfang loves me the most. If he comes out, he definitely won't sit idly by. Well, then it's clear. The most important thing now is to let you endure until your master comes out. There are ways, very simple, 2 ways. Exion's eyes suddenly brightened. Looking at Lu Chen with some admiration, she quickly said, Brother Lu, quickly teach me. Lu Chen stretched out the first finger and said, First, you pretend to be courteous to He Gang and pretend to be perfunctory. First, you can calm him down. If necessary, you can even let him take advantage of you. Endure until your master comes out and officially accepts you as a disciple. Then you can turn hostile. Exin was stunned for a moment. She suddenly shook her head and resolutely said, No. Lu Chen looked at her and asked, Why? Exion's face was full of disgust and said, That person is so disgusting now. Every time he comes to pester me, he talks and does things like he wants to eat me. I can't stand it. Lu Chen nodded to show that he understood and then said, Since that's the case, then there's a second way. But you should also understand the current situation, so to use this method, it depends on whether you are ruthless enough. EXN looked a little confused and said, Brother Lu, what do you want me to do? What do you mean ruthless enough? Lu Chen smiled and waved at her. EXN walked to his side and slightly bent down. Then she saw Lu Chen whispering something in her ear. As EXN listened, the expression on her face slowly changed. First, she was indescribably shocked, then her body trembled slightly, as if she was excited and afraid. In the middle, there was a complicated expression of blushing. After a long while, she straightened her body in a daze and turned to look at Lu Chen. She said with some difficulty, Is this okay? At this moment, it was the dead of night. That man was silent, just quietly sitting by the table in the pavilion. For some reason, EXN suddenly had a strange illusion. The man in front of her seemed to suddenly become especially strange. At that moment, EXN only felt that the surrounding darkness was like a tide, surrounding that man, making his face unclear, making him hide in the darkness. Even that faint smile that he occasionally revealed seemed to carry a trace of the coldness and sternness of the night. After a while, sitting in the darkness, Lu Chen said indifferently, I already said, I'm not a good person. Chapter 93. Time flowed by as the moon set and the clouds rose. Within the enormous Kunlun Mountains, countless people were busy walking their own paths. However, compared to the towering mountains, people were often like extremely tiny ants. They were busy doing their own thing all day long, yet they forgot to raise their heads to look at the boundless sky. EXN walked on the road of Rockpan Mountain, her face calm, without any extra expression. She was an official disciple, so she did not have to work all day long in exchange for a meager pay like the handyman disciples. However, she still needed help with some things like sorting and identifying spiritual materials. Besides, this kind of work also had great benefits. She could identify many useful spiritual materials, familiarize herself with their properties, and lay a solid foundation for her future alchemy or exploration. There were many huge rocks on Rockpan Mountain. One of the branch halls of Baichao Tang was built on the big rocks on the mountain. From afar, one could see the flying eaves and blue tiles. It looked extraordinary. EXIN was not the only one on the road. There were many disciples of Baichao Tang who had the same status as her coming and going. Many people noticed EXIN, and many people pointed at her and whispered to each other. Rumors were bound to spread at all times. EXIN didn't look at her fellow disciples. As she walked, the conversation she had with Lu Chen a few days ago, as well as some of the instructions he had given her after that, couldn't help but echo in her mind. In the vicinity of Rock Mountain, from 100 Herb Hall's branch, are there any female Jindan masters with profound cultivation and bad tempers? This was what Lu Chen had asked her that day. There are many female disciples in Baichao Tang. There are also a few female Jindan friar who are successful in cultivation. The one who came recently is Martial Uncle Yen of Melaleuca japonica. She is strict, and all the disciples are afraid of her. God is on your side. But the great cultivators of Jindan State never bother to know, and they don't care about our trivial matters. Then we'll force her to know, force her to take care of it. How can I do that? That depends on whether you are ruthless enough. Big Brother Lu, you're saying that again. I always feel scared when I hear it. The warm sunlight shone down on EXIN's body, making her feel a trace of warmth. She took a deep breath and forced herself to reveal a trace of a smile before walking towards the hall. The day passed uneventfully. In the afternoon, EXIN walked out of the main hall and began to walk down the mountain. When she arrived at the foot of the mountain, she pretended to casually glance at the flat and spacious spiritual fields. She saw many odd-job disciples working hard in the spiritual fields at the foot of the mountain. Unsurprisingly, she found a familiar face among them. Inconspicuous, Lu Chen stood in a spiritual field and smiled at her from afar. For some reason, seeing that smile, EXIN seemed to feel a little more support in her heart, and her originally panicked mind calmed down a little. But before she could think of what to do, suddenly, a gloomy and even somewhat hostile voice suddenly came from not far away. Junior Sister E, What a coincidence. We meet again. Xianxia's heart jumped, and her hands subconsciously clenched into fists. Then she turned her head to look, and what entered her eyes was that extremely ugly and frightening face. Xianxia slowly lowered her head, and there seemed to be a little fear on her face. She said in a low voice, "Senior brother Gang looked at Xianxia's pretty face, and saw that the fear and weakness not only did not damage her beauty in the slightest, but instead added a bit of sadness and delicateness to her beauty. He felt as if a scorching flame suddenly burned in his heart, like a wild beast suddenly roaring in his body. His eyes revealed a look of greed and desire, but his tone was very calm. He only smiled and said, "Junior sister I have something to say to you." Xianxia slightly raised her eyes, looked at that face, and found that when Gang smiled, the scar on his face twitched. That face became more and more frightening. She couldn't help but take a step back, and after 2 hurried breaths, said, "Senior brother if you have something to say, you can say it here." Gang sneered, looked at the many handyman disciples in the surrounding spiritual fields, and a look of contempt appeared in his eyes. He said, "There are too many people here, junior sister let's go to a place with fewer people to talk." As he spoke, Gang walked towards the forest that day. Xianxia's expression changed slightly, and she looked a little hesitant. Gang suddenly turned back, and with a ferocious look, he shouted fiercely, "Junior sister Xianxia's face showed a painful expression, but in the end she finally slowly walked out and followed Gang into the forest. This scene fell into the eyes of many handyman disciples, and even many official disciples of Bai Chao Tang who passed by and watched from afar also saw it. For a moment, everyone looked at each other. The forest was very quiet. Gang looked very happy that Xianxia had to follow him, and he walked in front proudly. Xianxia, on the other hand, slowly followed behind him. Lu Chen's words to her echoed in her mind. Every single word sounded simple and clear, but it was as if a knife was stabbing into her heart, and it was filled with pain and determination. "I told you to be ruthless, not to be ruthless to Gang, because it's useless. Nowadays, there are countless rumors about Gang. Even if you kill him, you won't be able to shut people's mouths. Instead, you'll become the target of gossip, and your family will definitely not be able to withstand Yi's vengeance. Gang is the one who wants you, and wants to skin you alive. I don't know about Yi, but maybe someone like him needs all the resources to help him break through to the Jin Dan. He might even be tempted by your family's property. What do you think? You'll lose both your wealth and your family. Can you stand it? Can't stand it? That's why you have to be ruthless to yourself. You have to be ruthless to yourself to the point where everyone is scared and in disbelief. Then, everyone will believe you. In this world, how can there be such a comfortable thing as reaping without sowing? Even if there is, it's not between you and me. That's why you have to be ruthless to yourself," Lu Chen said with a smile. Xianxia recalled that night, Lu Chen's voice and blurry face in the dark. She suddenly shuddered. She stared fixedly at Gang, who had stopped in front of her and turned around to look at her with a hateful smile. Her eyes twitched, and her body trembled slightly. All of this fell into Gang's eyes. He looked at Xianxia as if he was looking at a weak little chick. A tyrannical emotion seemed to rise from his heart. That terrifying scene of countless ferocious black dogs barking and biting each other flashed across his mind, causing him to tremble uncontrollably. He was scared. He was scared to death. Every time he dreamed of that scene, he would be scared to the point of peeing his pants. And every time he saw Xianxia's beautiful face, he would angrily think, why was she able to escape safely while he had to suffer like that? Everything was her fault. I want to let her taste that kind of pain. Ruthlessly ravage her, torture her, make her scream in pain. He crazily imagined it, as if this was the only way he could feel uncontrollable pleasure. It was at this time Gang heard Xianxia open her mouth, and with a trembling voice, she said, "Senior brother, don't force me like this, okay?" That young girl seemed like she was about to cry. There were tears in the corner of her eyes, and as if she had gathered all her courage, she said this to him. Chapter 94. He Gang sneered, his white teeth peeking out from his missing mouth. He looked especially ferocious, like a wolf or tiger. Exen took another step back and said in a trembling voice, "Don't force me, senior brother He." He Gang spat and said fiercely, "I want to force you, so what? I'll tell you clearly I want you. Follow me faithfully for the rest of your life. When my big brother reaches the golden core or nascent soul stage, you and your E-clan will enjoy endless wealth and glory." Exion's face was pale as she shook her head. After a while, she smiled bitterly. "Our E-family? So you really coveted our family property?" He Gang suddenly frowned, as if he felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't think of what it was, so he didn't bother to say more. With a wild laugh, he strode towards Exen, and at the same time, reached out to grab her, and said with a smile, "Junior sister E, I've missed you for a long time, today you," clang. A crisp sound abruptly interrupted He Gang's words. His body stopped, only to Exen pull out a sharp dagger and hold it horizontally in front of her. Her face carried a bit of determination, mixed with a bit of pain and despair, and even a bit of madness that He Gang had never seen before. It was vaguely similar to the look in He Gang's eyes before. He Gang jumped in fright, but he sneered. "What are you doing? Trying to scare me with a dagger? Stab me if you dare. Let's see if anyone from your E-family can survive after you kill me." Exen gritted her teeth and stared blankly in front of her. Her vision blurred, and she could almost hear her own painful and hopeless question from that day. "Why, Brother Lu, why? They were the ones who bullied me, but you want me to be cruel to myself?" Lu Chen's calm yet cold voice came from the darkness, echoing in her ears. "Because you're weak. But there's no justice in this world." "Yes, there's no justice, there's no reason. This is how the world works. Either you lie down and admit defeat and allow others to bully you, or you try your best to find some methods within your power, even if those methods seem painful and uncomfortable. You want me to give you justice and righteousness? I'm sorry, I don't have any. I'm not a good person, I can only teach you these things." "Ah," Exen suddenly screamed, like a little beast that was forced into a desperate situation. Her fear was not directed towards the ugly man in front of her, but rather towards an invisible aura. She trembled all over. When He Gang saw this, he was so excited that his body was trembling. He let out a roar, and his eyes were bloodshot. He suddenly rushed over and grinned, "Stinking whore, today I'll call you, damn whore, today I'll call you." The low muffled sound wasn't loud, but it was like a sudden clap of thunder. He Gang instantly stopped in his tracks and looked at Exen with a stunned and incredulous expression. That girl, that beautiful girl, had a pained expression on her face at this moment. However, her hand was gripping the dagger tightly, and she had stabbed it into her own body with a backhand. The dagger was incomparably sharp and pierced through her left shoulder. It could be imagined that Exen used all her strength. Dark red blood gushed out like a fountain and dyed half of Exen's clothes red. Exen's pale lips trembled slightly. She slowly pulled the dagger out from her flesh. The pain was like a tide that was about to drown this fragile woman. There were a few times when she felt that she was about to collapse. She was about to be unable to bear it, but for some reason she still stood there, standing in the pool of blood, coldly looking at the dumbfounded He Gang opposite her. Suddenly she felt a sense of pleasure amidst the pain. That ugly man was not as strong as she thought. Then she slowly lowered her head. Looking at the bloody wound, she shook her head. That ghostly cold voice seemed to be emotionless. Vaguely, it was saying terrible words to her. "Since you have decided to be ruthless, then be more ruthless. Since you have decided to do it, then you must do it to the extreme. Isn't that right? Isn't that right?" She smiled bitterly. Within the bloody light, there was a terrifying decisiveness that shouldn't have been present at her age. She suddenly screamed, and then held the blade upside down. She suddenly flipped it over and directly cut off her own flower-like, jade-like face. He Gang was scared silly. At this time he was really scared out of his wits. He stood there, dumbfounded at this bloody scene. He was completely at a loss, and his mind was blank. The feeling of the cold blade cutting through flesh made one's body feel like it was going to fall apart. Exen's body trembled non-stop. She gasped for breath, as if this was the only way she could persevere. But in her weak body, there seemed to be an unimaginable terrifying power that kept her going until now. Fresh blood dyed her body red. It was a ghastly sight to behold. However, she was like a phoenix rising from nirvana in the pool of blood. She looked down at the ugly man from above and saw the fear in his eyes. Thus, there was a bit of contempt in her eyes. She thought to herself, so what Brother Lu said was true. She laughed maniacally, shook her head, and did not look at He Gang again. She suddenly raised the dagger and slashed her clothes, directly cutting several wounds on her body. In an instant, blood spurted out. Then, she threw the dagger away and used her hands to tear open her clothes, revealing a piece of originally snow-white soft skin that was now dyed red with blood. The beautiful body that was hidden under the clothes looked unusually bright red, and there was a kind of tragedy that could not be looked at directly. Then, she raised her head again. This forest was as quiet as the bridge of helplessness in the underworld. It was like the terrifying sea of blood in the hell of evil spirits. She didn't know why, but there was suddenly a relieved smile on her face. She just smiled like that. Then, she suddenly let out an incomparably sharp scream. She staggered out of the forest. Along the way, blood flowed all over the ground, dyeing the entire road red. He Gang still hadn't come back to his senses. He stood there in a daze. His eyes fell on the dark red pool of blood on the ground. It seemed that he still hadn't broken free from the tragic scene that had just occurred. After a while, outside the forest, there was a sudden commotion. Some people cried out, some people shouted angrily. There was also a woman's voice that was already crying. Someone, quickly come and save junior sister E. Medicine. Who has medicine to stop the bleeding? Why is she bleeding so much? No. Quickly go to the mountain and ask Marshal Aunt Yen to come down. Only she can save junior sister E. In the midst of the chaos, the commotion became bigger and bigger. It seemed to gradually converge into a raging tide, crazily surging in all directions. In the spirit field behind the crowd, a man stood far away and watched this terrifying scene from beginning to end. When the crowd gathered, he expressionlessly raised his head and looked at the sky. The sky was blue and cloudless. Today was a sunny day. Chapter 95. The incident that took place at the foot of Rock Mountain that day was witnessed by many Baichao Tang disciples and even more Chor's disciples. When the blood-soaked woman staggered out of the forest, the horrifying scene instantly shocked everyone. Dark red blood flowed on that beautiful face, piercing into everyone's eyes like a sharp knife, causing their eyes to sting. They held their breath and tensed up involuntarily. Like a boulder thrown into the water, it instantly set off a monstrous wave. The Kunlun party was, after all, a prestigious and upright sect. Jean Dan Friar Melaleuca Japonica, who was in charge of the Baichao Tang sect on Rock Mountain, immediately rushed down the mountain after receiving the news to protect Xin and heal her. At the same time, someone noticed that someone was trying to sneak out of the forest. It was He Gang, so he immediately shouted for them to expose him. Thinking of all the things that happened before, the crowd was instantly agitated and many people cursed it out loud. However, He Gang's elder brother, He, was too famous. Although the crowd was angry, no one dared to stop them. At this moment, the white-haired Melaleuca Japonica suddenly appeared next to He Gang without saying a word. Then she slapped him hard in the face. That afternoon, at the edge of the forest at the foot of Rock Mountain, everyone heard the crisp sound of bones breaking and the man's heart-wrenching scream. Of course, no one paid attention to him. By evening, the incident had spread throughout the Kunlun party and caused a sensation in all sections. The E family of Kunwa City had rushed to the mountain after hearing the news. It was said that the scene was so tragic that the girl's mother fainted when she saw her daughter. Xianxia's father and other relatives and friends were all furious. Baichao Tang sect was one of the most important sects in the Kunlun party. It was powerful and well established. In just one day, 2 Yuaning Jinren and 7 Jean Dan Friar immortals came directly to Rock Mountain. At night, the huge mountain was still brightly lit. Countless people came in and out. The sky was full of colorful lights and colorful rainbows flew across the sky, making the moon and stars dim. It was the immortal masters and Jinren who came on clouds and wind, like the eve of a storm. Higang wanted to escape, but Melaleuca Japonica broke his bones on the spot and caught him. He was thrown at the foot of Rock Mountain, howling and screaming. No one came near and no one dared to save him. When night fell, someone from the Rock Mountain passed down the order. Higang was tied up and hung on a big tree in front of the mountain, facing the boundless spirit fields and countless onlookers of the Oddjob disciples. This was, of course, an undisguised insult and venting of anger. Higang screamed and defended himself, saying that Xianxia was a bitch and that she did everything herself. She stabbed herself and it had nothing to do with Higang. In the cold mountain wind, Higang's voice gradually became hoarse and weak. In the end, others could only hear him calling his brother's name in a low voice. But this night, he never showed up. Higang was also hung for the whole night. Within the sects of Kunlun, every hall on every mountain peak seemed to have smelled something that night. Everyone was silent. And among the huge mountains of Kunlun, there seemed to be a sense of mutual hostility that night. The next morning, there was news from the powerful Heavenly Soldier Hall, which was in charge of the magic weapon refining and the forging of celestial weapons in the Kunlun party. Dukan Jinren, who had a high reputation in the Heavenly Soldier Hall, summoned his most beloved disciple He to the famous Heavenly Fire Hall of the Kunlun party and reprimanded him for a long time. He knelt on the ground and did not dare to speak. It was even said that Dukan Jinren, in his rage, directly hit and slapped and kicked He, causing He to repeatedly kowtow in front of the hall until his face was bruised and bleeding. However, when the news came, the stone mountain did not seem to be moved at all. The entire mountain was silent, like an angry giant beast, coldly looking at its opponent in the Kunlun mountain range. The atmosphere in the Kunlun party became more and more tense the next day. The disciples of the Heavenly Soldier Hall suddenly could not get elixirs and elixirs from the elixir room. In the argument, the disciples on both sides, especially the disciples of Bai Chao Tang, became more and more provocative. The situation even seemed to be worsening. But on this night, the head of the Kunlun party, Immortal Idol Month, suddenly arrived at the Stone Mountain. Together with her was the chief elder of the Heavenly Soldier Hall, Dukan Jinren. They first went to visit Xianxia, who was seriously injured and on the verge of death. Of course, under the care and treatment of so many powerful cultivators of Bai Chao Tang, Xianxia's injuries had greatly improved. Then, Immortal Idol Month came forward to host the meeting. She summoned Dukan Jinren and the two immortal masters of Bai Chao Tang, Qian Deng and Mingzhu. They found a quiet room to talk behind closed doors. They chatted for half a day. However, when they walked out of the door, everyone on the Rock Mountain saw the four highly respected Yuaning Jinren smiling. They were like celestial beings who did not eat the food of the mortal world. They greeted each other, looked forward to the bright future of Kunlun, talked about the hardships on the road of cultivation, and only said that the celestial path was brilliant and that it was the right path of the mortal world. Dukan Jinren then took his leave and floated away. During this time, he never mentioned Higang, who was still hanging on the big tree at the foot of the stone mountain. The people of Bai Chao Tang also seemed to have forgotten about this matter. After this, the matter quickly subsided. Higang was released after being hung for 3 days. His brother, He, picked him up and sent him out of Kunlun Mountain. He found a house in Kunwa City to stay and recuperate. It seemed that he wouldn't return to the mountain for a while. After finishing this matter, he immediately announced to everyone that he would follow his master's order and immediately go into closed-door training to comprehend and break through the incomparably difficult Jin Dan realm. Everything was like a breeze blowing. After the turbulence, it finally gradually calmed down. The majestic Kunlun was still the same as before. Everything was as usual. Late at night, the stone mountain was no longer as lively and tense as it was a few days ago. After the lights dimmed, there was only silence. It was unknown how many people had entered the land of dreams at this moment. The darkness of the night seemed to be everywhere. A shadow that blended with the darkness quietly moved forward in the darkness. It silently passed through the houses, bypassed the guards, and finally stopped outside a house in the depths of the mountain. The window was gently closed. As if the night wind blew in, it made a squeaking sound and swayed a little. On the bed in the house, Xianxia turned over and rubbed her eyes sleepily. Suddenly, her body trembled and she sat up abruptly. She found that there was suddenly an extra shadow beside her bed. But before she could scream, a large hand had already covered her mouth, forcing her to swallow all her cries. Chapter 96. Woo! Woo! Xianxia let out a muffled cry and struggled desperately, but the black figure suddenly leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Xianxia's body suddenly stiffened, and then she stopped struggling. She calmed down, only her eyes in the darkness still revealed a trace of horror. The hand covering her mouth slowly withdrew, and the black figure still sat on the edge of her bed. A pair of bright eyes appeared in the darkness, and then his appearance was gradually seen clearly. It was Lu Chen. "Brother Lu." Xianxia softly called out, and after the shock in her eyes, there was finally some joy. She did not know why, but she suddenly felt sour in her eyes, and after a moment, 2 lines of tears silently flowed down from her pale face. The tears streaked across her white and tender skin, and the bandaged wound on one side of her face was still not removed, making her look particularly miserable. Lu Chen quietly looked at the girl sitting in the darkness crying silently, sighed, and then reached out to wipe away the tears on her face and said, "Don't cry, you did well." Xianxia stared at him in a daze, her lips slightly trembling, and the scenes of these days flashed through her mind. Suddenly, she realized that so many people from the same sect, so many relatives, and even her parents, seemed to be separated from them by a layer. In these few days, she desperately suppressed her fear, endured her nervousness, and only at this time, in this dark and quiet night, in front of this man who seemed to be one with the darkness like a shadow, did she suddenly feel a trace of relief. He knew all the secrets, and there was no need to pretend anything in front of him. Xianxia just looked at him like this, and unknowingly, tears flowed down her face again, and even her voice trembled and choked. "Lu, brother Lu." "I'm so scared." Lu Chen raised his hand as if he wanted to comfort Xianxia, but when he just raised his hand, he suddenly felt a warm body jumping into his arms, tightly hugging his arm, desperately suppressing her trembling voice and crying, "I'm so scared, brother Lu. At that time I was so scared, I was in so much pain. I've never been in so much pain in my life. I saw myself bleeding so much, my whole body was covered in blood, I even cut my own face. From now on I am an ugly person." Sob sob, sob 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 sob. Lu Chen's hands froze in the air. For a moment he did not know whether to raise or let go, and could only let Xianxia vent in his arms. After a while, he found that Xianxia did not seem to show signs of calming down, so he could only gently pat the girl's shoulder and whispered, okay, it's all over." Perhaps his comfort had some effect. Xianxia's crying slowly quieted down. After a while, she slowly left Lu Chen's body, lowered her head and sat on the bed again, but kept using her hand to wipe the tears on her face. A hand held a handkerchief and handed it to her. Xianxia hesitated for a moment, took it, and while wiping her face, she whispered, "Thank you." Well, this is the final result of the matter. The room was still dark. In the darkness, Lu Chen and Xianxia sat on the same bed, somewhat strangely and somewhat inexplicably ambiguous. Separated by some distance, they listened to Lu Chen talk about what happened these days. Finally, as if coming to a conclusion, Lu Chen said, "If nothing unexpected happens, He will be grounded for a very long time in closed-door meditation, and Yi Gang is currently recuperating in Kunwa City, but it will be very difficult for him to return to the Kunlun party. Perhaps he will be expelled from the sect." Xianxia's breathing seemed to quicken in the darkness for a while, and then with a hint of disbelief, she said, "Really? Really?" Xianxia was silent for a moment, and then she let out a long breath, as if a big stone that had been pressing on her heart for a long time had finally been moved. After a while, she sighed softly, "Our Kunlun party still has its justice. But this time, because of me, they actually alarmed so many seniors and elders, really?" Before she finished speaking, Xianxia suddenly saw Lu Chen, who was next to her, turn his head to look at her. A pair of bright but deep eyes stared at her. For some reason, Yaxen suddenly felt weak in her heart, and her voice involuntarily dropped. After a moment, she stammered, Did I say something wrong? Lu Chen looked at her with a faint smile and said, Do you really think that Bai Chao Tang and Heavenly Soldier Hall made such a big movement just for you? Yaxen was stunned. After a while, she said with a stutter, Didn't I? In the beginning, of course it was for you. That day when you came out of the forest, the scene was bloody and tragic. No one could stand it. So, including your martial uncle Melaleuca Japonica, she angrily made a move because she couldn't help you. But what kind of influential family is the Kunlun party? There are so many masters and recluses in Baichao Tang. How could they rashly fall out with such an important hall like Heavenly Soldier Hall for the sake of you, an insignificant new disciple? Before, even you didn't dare to believe that it would be like this, right? Exen silently nodded and said, Then why on earth, Brother Lu? Lu Chen smiled and said, Because there are still people who don't like the He brothers. Just like you, a disciple of a sect from an aristocratic family in Kunwa City. Exen was startled and said with some doubt, That can't be. Although my family is also one of the aristocratic families in Kunwa City, to be honest, our family has been very ordinary these years. We haven't produced any particularly outstanding talents, and the other aristocratic families rarely pay attention to us. Lu Chen said indifferently, It has nothing to do with this. It's just that all the people from aristocratic families have different circumstances since childhood, so they naturally more or less have a sense of superiority. When some people see you, won't they think of something else? What if the person that he gang likes is a girl from another aristocratic family? Aristocratic families have confidence, strength, and influence, so they naturally aren't afraid. But what about those small and medium-sized aristocratic families? Do they deserve to be bullied by this rising young man? Taking a step back, even if they are aristocratic families now, what if they become like the family in a few decades or hundreds of years? At that time, what will their daughters do when they meet this kind of person? He sat quietly in the darkness and looked at the injured girl. He was calm and even faintly cold as he said, So the key to this matter lies in the place where it happened. If you were bullied by He gang in the land of chaos, or even worse than today, the Kunlun party's reaction wouldn't be as big. But this time, it happened in the Kunlun party and under the eyes of all the Kunlun disciples. This is a slap in the face of the several hundred aristocratic families in Kunwa City. It would be strange if they didn't kill the He brothers. Exen stared blankly at Lu Chen, who was sitting in the shadows. Looking at his deep eyes that were faintly discernible in the darkness, she suddenly said softly, Brother Lu, When you first helped me think of the idea, did you already think of everything that would happen later? Chapter 97. Lu Chen glanced at Exen and said, Why do you ask? Exen lowered her head silently. After a long while, she whispered, Nothing. I just feel that Brother Lu, you are thinking so far ahead. You are so powerful. Do you regret letting me help you? Exen's body trembled slightly. She quickly shook her head and said, No. I didn't mean that. You helped me for my own good. I know that. I am grateful to you from the bottom of my heart. I am especially... Do you remember that you promised to do something for me? Lu Chen suddenly interrupted her. Exen was stunned for a moment and said, Yes. Lu Chen said lightly, That's good. After this matter, no matter what, 100 Herb Hall will value you even more. Plus, you're someone that Dongfang Tao has taken a liking to and your talent isn't bad, so your position in 100 Herb Hall in the future will be much better than it is now. This is good for both of us. Exen was speechless. She didn't know what to say for a moment. Lu Chen stood up and said, It's late. You should rest early. I'm leaving. Exen thought of something and said, Brother Lu, I remember that there are guards outside. How did you get in? Lu Chen stood in the darkness and smiled slightly. He didn't answer her question. He stepped back and quickly merged into the darkness. Exen widened her eyes and looked towards the darkness, only to see a few faint ripples suddenly appearing on the quiet surface of the water in the deep darkness. When she looked again carefully, there was no sign of anyone. Silently shuttling through the darkness, like the shadow of the moon, he came down from the top of the rock mountain without anyone noticing. Lu Chen looked up at the night sky and saw that it was already late at night. It was already past midnight. It was already the curfew time in the Kunlun party. Speaking of this curfew, it was a special rule in the Kunlun party. Other cultivation sects rarely had such restrictions. After all, the cultivators who practiced immortality and refinement were all strong and energetic. It was not a big deal even if they didn't sleep for a day and night. But in the Kunlun party, this rule of forbidding the disciples to go out after midnight had been around for a long time. It was said that it could even be traced back to the early days of the Kunlun party, which had a history of thousands of years. In short, the Kunlun sect was a famous sect with a lot of rules. Coupled with the name of restraining its disciples to concentrate on cultivation, it was actually not particularly strange. Just like that, they persisted year after year. But of course, the so-called curfew could not be completely empty. Such a large mountain, such a large territory, if there were no guards patrolling, wouldn't it have been looted by countless thieves? Therefore, in the darkness of the night, although the nearby mountain path was quiet, there would occasionally be a group of patrolling guards passing by. Lu Chen walked quietly on the mountain road. When there were guards, he would often hide in advance. The guards, who were usually at least in the Foundation realm, seemed to have never noticed a low-level handyman disciple like him wandering outside late at night. Rock Mountain was where the official disciples of the Baichao Tang lived. The handyman disciples lived some distance away. Lu Chen walked and soon passed a fork in the road. A stone staircase extended up from the side of the mountain road. Lu Chen paused and remembered that this was the pavilion where he and Xianxia met late at night a few days ago. Thinking about what he said that night and Xianxia's appearance at that time, then thinking about how things seemed to have turned upside down in just a few days, Lu Chen felt a little emotional, but he did not intend to stop and continued to walk forward. The footsteps gradually faded away and Lu Chen's figure also disappeared into the darkness. But after a while, in this quiet mountain forest, as the cold night wind blew, a blurry figure suddenly walked out from the gloomy pavilion halfway up the mountain. The figure was that of a slender woman. Because it was too dark, it was impossible to see her appearance clearly. One could only faintly see that she was standing on the edge of the pavilion, gazing in the direction that Lu Chen had left. The night wind blew, causing her clothes and hair to float. A flash of light flitted through the night. It was a scarlet feather shawl draped over her shoulder. She silently stood in the darkness. After a while, she turned around and walked toward the summit. The days in Kunlun Mountain once again calmed down. The He brothers went into seclusion, and Mount Li went into seclusion. Afterwards, this matter was quickly forgotten. Everyone once again began to live the same leisurely days as before, cultivating, refining, and competing to become immortals. In the spiritual fields at the base of Rockpan Mountain, the various kinds of spiritual plants had also reached the point of maturity. Baichao Tang sent people down to take the harvest with great familiarity. Then, according to the rules, the surplus harvested spiritual plants were given to the odd job disciples. Afterwards, they exchanged them on the spot. Basically, everyone exchanged them for spirit stones. The number of spirit stones varied, but this was the first time that most of the odd job disciples had extra money on hand. Thus, before they began planting the next batch of spiritual fields, they had half a month of comfortable days to pass. Many people were already calculating what kind of miraculous medicine they should exchange for to assist in their cultivation, or perhaps they should inquire about whether the sect had better cultivation methods they could purchase. Lu Chen's harvest was also not bad. He had obtained 30 spirit stones, which was considered a lot among the odd job disciples. However, before the spirit stones had warmed up in his bosom, an uninvited guest came to find him. "Treat, Brother Lu." When Exen found Lu Chen, she was smiling so happily that even her eyes seemed to be squinting. Although on the night when she was injured, Xian still seemed to be a little uneasy, but as her injuries improved, she still secretly looked at Lu Chen in a new light. She secretly regarded him as her most trustworthy friend, often sneaking over to talk to him. On this day, after receiving the spirit stones, Xian came to his door to ask for some money. Lu Chen unhappily rolled his eyes at this smiling young girl. Your family is obviously rich. Why do you always think of a pauper like me? Xianxia smiled. That's not the same. It's especially delicious to eat your treat. Lu Chen said, You've learned bad things. Xianxia pulled him away and said, That's because I learned bad things from you. Less nonsense, let's go, let's go. Besides, I haven't seen Atsu for a long time. You always said it wasn't good to go up the mountain, so you left it in Kanwa City. It's so pitiful. Lu Chen couldn't dissuade her, so he had no choice but to follow her. However, he hadn't gone down the mountain for quite some time, so he also wanted to find some free time to go to Old Ma's place to take a look. The two of them walked all the way to the southern mountain gate of the Kunlun party. Just as they were about to pass under the majestic memorial archway of the mountain gate and leave the mountain, they suddenly saw a sudden commotion coming from below. The Kunlun disciples walking in front of them suddenly made way for a path. Soon after, a group of people walked over. Lu Chen and Xianxia didn't know what was going on. They were a bit puzzled, but they still followed the crowd and stood to the side. Before long, that group of people walked past them. The leader was an old man with white hair and a youthful complexion. He looked like an immortal, and his aura was truly extraordinary. He seemed to be an expert who had achieved the Tao. Walking next to this imposing old man was a little girl. She looked about 10 years old, had an ethereal temperament, and was extremely beautiful. Moreover, the most amazing thing about her was that despite her young age, she seemed to have a kind of cold and holy aura. She was like a white lotus on a snowy peak, making people not dare to approach her. Lu Chen, who was standing to the side, suddenly frowned. His gaze fell on the girl's face, and he discovered that he had seen this incomparably holy girl before. Chapter 98. Perhaps she sensed something. The girl, who had been expressionless and cold all along the way, suddenly glanced at the side of the road when she walked past Lu Chen. Lu Chen happened to be looking at her as well. Their gazes met in midair. After a brief collision, they parted as if nothing had happened. The young lady with a peerlessly beautiful appearance, aloof and outstanding temperament went all the way up the mountain. It was only then that the numerous Kunlun disciples at the mountain gate heaved a sigh of relief. They whispered to each other, but it seemed that no one knew the young lady's identity. However, many people recognized the old man who walked at the front. He was the powerful Jin Dan friar Zhuoxian of their sect. His identity and status weren't simple. He was the junior brother of the current sect master of Kunlun, Reverend Idle Month. At the same time, he was also the second disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan, who cultivated in closed-door cultivation on the Winter Peak, one of the 4 wondrous peaks in the sky and clouds. The little girl, who was personally brought up the mountain by a person with strength and background that couldn't be underestimated, naturally attracted a lot of people's attention. Soon, some people guessed that she might be the new disciple that Master Zhuoxian had just accepted. That was the good fortune that the little girl had accumulated over several lifetimes. When Lu Chen walked out of the mountain gate, he looked back and saw that the group of people had already disappeared into the distance. His eyes flashed, but in the end he gently shook his head and smiled. There was a strange expression on his face. "Brother Lu, what are you smiling about?" Xianxia asked when she saw his expression. "Nothing." Lu Chen answered perfunctorily and said with a smile, "Let's go. We'll go to Kanwa City and see if that stupid dog has starved to death." Xianxia agreed with a smile. Soon after, she suddenly glared at Lu Chen and said with a somewhat suspicious attitude, "Brother Lu, could it be that you entrusted the wrong person to make Atsu starve? Even if I starve to death, I won't be able to reach it." In the deserted Black Hill Pavilion, the fatty old Ma angrily complained to Lu Chen, "I say, Lu Chen, where did you find such a vicious dog? He's too hateful." "Atsu is not a vicious dog." Xianxia's voice came from the side. At this moment, she was squatting on the ground with a smile on her face. She threw a few words here and then turned away. The shiny black dog Atsu was jumping around her happily, wagging its tail and rubbing its head against Xianxia's body. From time to time, it happily stuck out its tongue to lick Xianxia's face and hands, making Xianxia giggle nonstop. "What's wrong? You look a little haggard," Lu Chen said to old Ma with a smile. Nonsense, you have such a dog at home, how can it make people happy? Old Ma said angrily. What's wrong with Atsu? I remember that this dog is very stupid, but it seems to be quite honest. Old Ma snorted and said, I've never seen such a greedy dog. It seems to think about eating all day long. Other dogs need to eat for 3 days, but it can finish in 1 day. And no matter if it's raw or cooked, no matter where I hide, this dog always seems to be able to dig 3 feet into the ground and find me. In the end, I became so angry that I stopped buying food, and it actually began to steal the spirit herbs on my counter. Lu Chen was also a little surprised when he heard this. He said, How can this be? I didn't notice it before. As he said this, he waved to Atsu and called out, Atsu, come here. The black dog immediately jumped over happily. Its movements were vigorous, although its hind legs were still limping. Lu Chen squatted down and touched Atsu's head. He looked at it again and found that Atsu seemed to have grown a lot this time, and its fur was bright and smooth. It seemed that it really ate well. He looked up at Old Ma and smiled. Then, Old Ma glared at him. You took good care of it, Lu Chen said to Old Ma seriously. I think you are very suitable to raise a dog. Raise your head. Old Ma waved his hand and said, Take it away quickly, or I will kill it sooner or later. Lu Chen smiled and wanted to say something, but Xianxia next to him came over and said with a smile, Brother Lu, let's take Atsu back to the mountain. Ah, that's good. Before Lu Chen could speak, Old Ma had already come over and agreed with a smile, not giving Lu Chen a chance to refuse. Lu Chen pushed the fat man away and said to Xianxia, I am still a handyman disciple. It is not convenient for me to take it up the mountain. Xianxia waved her hand and said with a smile, It's okay. I can take Atsu up the mountain. I can raise it. Lu Chen shook his head and said with a smile, You really do like this stupid dog a lot, huh? Xianxia showed a loving expression on her face. She touched Atsu's head and said with a smile, We have gone through hardships together, right Atsu? Atsu barked, Woof, woof, woof. While Xianxia was playing with Atsu in the small courtyard, Lu Chen and Old Ma walked to the side of the veranda and whispered to each other while watching. You know what happened to the He brothers? Old Ma responded, then glanced at Xianxia who was playing with Atsu, especially at the light scar on her cheek, and then said lightly, I didn't know this little girl was so cruel. Lu Chen said, There's nothing a person won't do when they're cornered. Old Ma turned to look at him and said, Did others force her, or did you force her? Lu Chen said, If I force her, do you think she will still follow me? That's true. Old Ma admitted this point, then said, Now that He Gang has been expelled from the sect, he didn't speak up for his only brother. Lu Chen said, He has too many troubles. Many influential families in Kunwa City have a lot of hidden forces in the Kunlun party. Now everyone hates him. If he's smart, he'll hide from this storm and come out after at least a year of closed-door meditation. Old Ma smiled and nodded. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard Lu Chen say, By the way, He Gang should still be hiding in Kunwa City, but he's hidden under the arrangement of his big brother. Go find that guy's whereabouts and residence, then tell me. Old Ma was startled and said, Do you have a grudge against He Gang? Old Ma hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Xianxia on the other side and said softly, Little Lu, don't tell me, you want to help her vent her anger? Lu Chen's face was expressionless as he said, No. I just feel that as long as this person doesn't die, he might be an idle person. Knowing a little bit of his whereabouts and movements might be useful in the future. Old Ma thought for a moment and said, Okay, I'll handle this matter, but it may take some time to find him. No hurry, take your time. Old Ma suddenly smiled and looked at Lu Chen, saying, What value does that trash He Gang have? Are you aiming at he? Lu Chen sighed and said, That damn Baldy is used to being a hands-off shopkeeper. He just told me to look for him, then ran to the immortal city thousands of miles away. In this huge Kunlun party with countless disciples, it's really like looking for a needle in a haystack. But finally I thought of something. Old Ma's eyes lit up and he said, What is it? Lu Chen smiled faintly and said, That devil cult spy wants to do such a big thing, so he must be planning something big. He must also be an extremely outstanding talent. Of course, such a person is also outstanding in the Kunlun sect. Therefore, the direction that I'm looking for may be those elite figures. He should also be considered a powerful figure. Chapter 99. When they returned to the mountain, in front of the mountain gate of the Kunlun party, as expected, the two people with the black dog were stopped. However, as a handyman disciple, Lu Chen couldn't say anything, while Exen just hugged Atsu tightly and then silently looked at the few guarding disciples of the Kunlun party who stopped them. After a pleading look appeared on her face, the guarding disciples looked at each other and then quickly let them go. The Kunlun party generally does not allow these cats and dogs to go up the mountain. Usually, those who do so will be stopped by the guarding disciples at the mountain gate. While walking on the mountain road of Kunlun, Exen said to Lu Chen with a little pride, "But I specifically checked the sect rules. This matter is too small, so small that our ancestors did not include this matter in the sect rules at all. And Kunlun Mountain is so big. Although there are no monsters, there are all kinds of mountain cats and small beasts in the mountains at the edge. How can they really be banned?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "Smart." Exine stuck out her tongue and smiled. Then she leaned over and patted the head of Atsu, who was following her, and sighed. "In fact, those senior brothers know about me and they feel sorry for me. This is also good. Being able to let Atsu go up the mountain with me, at least my suffering was not in vain." Lu Chen laughed. After walking for a while, the two were about to separate. Unexpectedly, at this time, Atsu habitually followed Lu Chen, which made Exen so angry that she hugged Atsu, the heartless black dog, and tried to persuade it to go with her. Who knew that the stupid dog Atsu was not grateful, and it was determined to follow Lu Chen. In the end, the helpless Exen could only wave goodbye to them with a sad face. Fortunately, now that they were living in the mountain of Kunlun, they could visit Atsu at any time. After Exen walked far away, Lu Chen walked back to his residence with Atsu. At the same time, he looked at Atsu, who was running back and forth excitedly because it came to a new place, and he was a little confused. Why did this lame black dog insist on following him? In the land of chaos, perhaps it could be explained by instinct, but after such a long time, including staying at Old Ma's place, this black dog was still so close to him. It seemed that something was not quite right. But after thinking about it, Lu Chen still could not figure out the reason, so in the end, he laughed at himself and thought that perhaps birds of a feather flocked together. The handyman disciples were the most numerous people in the huge population of the Kunlun party, but they had the lowest status. Lu Chen was one of the handyman disciples, so it was impossible for him to live on Rockpan Mountain like an official disciple like Xian, let alone an elite disciple like He who could have his own cave. The place where he lived was in a remote valley some distance away from Rockpan Valley. There were many terraced houses built here for the handyman disciples to live in. The house that belonged to Lu Chen was an inconspicuous one. It was not big, with a front door and a back window, gray walls and black tiles, and it looked a little depressing. After unlocking the door and pushing it open, Lu Chen habitually paused at the door for a moment, while Atsu, who was at his feet, curiously poked its head out from behind him and looked into the door. After a while, Lu Chen walked in and saw a simple table, chair, and a bed in the room. Other than that, there was almost no other furniture. Woof woof. Atu barked twice, then jumped onto the bed. He lay there and grinned at Lu Chen, as if he couldn't stop smiling. Stupid dog. Lu Chen looked at Atsu with a look of disgust. He walked over and patted its butt, driving Atsu away, and said, "You are so dirty. Can't you let me sleep?" Woof woof. Atsu shook its head and wagged its tail, then sniffed here and there in the room. After a while, it ran to the door and lay on the ground. The next day, Xian came looking for Atu. At the same time, she brought a lot of food that Atu liked to eat. The black dog was so happy that it jumped up and down. Woof woof. After feeding Atsu, Xian asked Lu Chen what did Atsu eat yesterday. Lu Chen confidently said that there were so many forests around, and he drove Atsu into the forest to find its own food, and it would come back when it was full. Xian was stunned for a long time, and she almost cried while hugging Atsu. She hated that Atsu had no conscience. It only wagged its tail and was affectionate with Xian, but once Xian wanted to take it away, Atsu would resist. After trying a few times, Xian finally gave up helplessly. She secretly decided to come here a few more times in the future and take good care of this poor little dog that had no parents. Lu Chen directly ignored Xian's kindness. Atsu, on the other hand, would desperately suck up to them when there was food and ignore them when they were full. They had no moral integrity to speak of. Days passed by, and in the blink of an eye, it was time for the second batch of spirit herbs to be planted. Lu Chen continued to live between the house and the spirit field, but the difference was that he often had a black dog by his side, which was always happy and active. Of course, the disciples of the same sect were a little surprised that Lu Chen suddenly had a dog by his side, but it was not a big deal, so no one bothered. Atsu followed Lu Chen all day long. When Lu Chen was working in the spirit herb field, it would wander around the Stone Pan Valley. Sometimes, it would run into the forest, and sometimes, it would lie on the field and sleep. In this immortal sect that mortals yearned for, at least Atsu's life was very comfortable. After eating, it would sleep. After waking up, it would play. When it was tired, it would sleep and eat again. Even immortals could not compare to this happy life. After a period of time, one day at noon, Atsu left the Stone Pan Valley and ran into a forest at the edge of the Stone Pan Valley. During this period of time, it had been running around everywhere, and it had almost explored the surrounding terrain of the Stone Pan Valley. It had also left many urine traces in many places. The forest in front of them was located in the north of the Stone Pan Valley, and it was the last territory that it had not explored yet. Atsu stepped into the forest confidently, and as usual, patrolled the spiritual land and sniffed everywhere. The forest was very quiet. Occasionally, there was the sound of birds chirping, but no one knew where it came from in the dense branches. Sunlight shone through the gaps between the branches and leaves, illuminating the flat path in the forest. Atsu sniffed the ground all the way. Sometimes it trotted, sometimes it walked slowly. Before it knew it, it had already walked a long distance. Suddenly, in a dark corner of the forest, a blurry shadow flashed past the dense foliage behind the trees. Atsu's ears suddenly pricked up, and it stopped suddenly. Then, it suddenly turned around and let out a low growl. Its eyes revealed a hint of fierceness. However, there was nothing behind it, only an empty forest. Atsu stared at the empty forest for a while, and gradually relaxed. There seemed to be some doubts in its eyes, but it still turned around and continued forward. After a few steps, a sound suddenly came from its side, as if someone had suddenly stepped on the forest ground and broken a dead branch. When the crack sound came, Atsu suddenly jumped up and bared its teeth in that direction, revealing its sharp fangs. In that direction, behind a thicket, there was a sudden movement of branches and leaves. Then, from behind the branches, a figure slowly appeared. An abnormally beautiful but somewhat cold little girl's face appeared behind the bushes. She looked at the black dog not far away with a strange look in her eyes. Chapter 100. In the depths of the forest, it was quiet. Separated by a clump of leaves, the black dog and the girl who suddenly appeared looked at each other. For some reason, Atsu looked a little nervous. It widened its eyes and stared unblinkingly at the girl behind the trees, especially when it suddenly raised its head and sniffed the air a few times with its nose. Atsu suddenly took a step back, and the hair on its neck slowly stood up. It let out a low growl and showed its sharp fangs to the little girl. Dog. The little girl behind the trees also looked at Atsu. She seemed a little surprised and a little curious. After a while, the branches and leaves suddenly shook, and then she walked out from behind the trees. She was like a fairy that had fallen into the mortal world, elegant and pure. With every step she took, the green branches and leaves seemed to sway gently for her. Her right hand was behind her back, and her left hand was at her side. She gradually showed a trace of a smile, as if she was naive, and walked towards Atsu. The growl in Atsu's throat suddenly became louder, as if it was full of wariness and hostility towards this beautiful girl. Huh! The girl seemed a little surprised. She stopped walking, but the way she looked at Atsu seemed to be a little more interested. After looking at Atsu with her clear and bright eyes, she pondered for a while, and then seemed to think of something and smiled slightly. Come here. The girl squatted down 6 or 7 feet away from Atsu. She still maintained the strange posture of her right hand behind her back, and then raised her left hand. Her skin was as white as snow, and it looked as delicate and beautiful as a spring onion. She waved at Atsu and deliberately lowered her voice, as if she was whispering to it. There was a trace of inexplicable strangeness in her voice, and she said, "Little dog, come here." Atsu stood there motionlessly, his eyes fixed on the strangely beautiful little girl, as if he didn't hear her greeting. The atmosphere in the forest was silent and a little stiff, but the girl didn't seem to care. She narrowed her eyes slightly, but her gaze seemed to be getting brighter and brighter. She looked at Atsu and smiled. Then, she stretched out her white and tender fingers and said to Atsu, "Little dog, are you feeling very hungry? Do you feel like you can't eat your fill?" Atsu stared at her and made a muffled sound. He sounded angry and confused at the same time. The young girl smiled and squatted on the ground. Her voice seemed to gradually carry an indescribable allure. It was almost hard to imagine that this ghostly voice actually came from the mouth of a little girl who was only about 10 years old. "I can help you. Come here, I'll give you something to eat. A type of food that you truly desire but have never seen before," she smiled, looking as holy and beautiful as a fairy, but her pair of eyes seemed to be flashing a terrible and crazy flame from hell. Atsu hesitated, as if he couldn't make up his mind. But after a while, he seemed to be unable to resist the mysterious temptation. Finally, he took a step forward and slowly walked up to the little girl. It no longer bared its teeth, and the hair on its neck also calmed down. Occasionally, its tail would shake, but most of the time, Atsu still looked at the little girl with doubt and a little caution. A satisfied smile slowly appeared on the girl's face. She stretched out her hand and gently touched Atsu's forehead. Atsu made a subtle movement and then heard the girl's voice become deep and ethereal. She slowly took out her right hand from behind her back. "I know what you desire most in your heart is actually this thing," she whispered to Atsu. Light shone through the gaps between the dense branches and leaves. Suddenly, there was a sudden silence in the depths of the forest. The wind stopped, and the trees were quiet. It was as if the whole world had stopped. A smear of dark red suddenly appeared, smearing this part of the world with a shocking trace of blood. Right in front of Atsu's eyes was her right hand that had just appeared. Fresh blood dripped down, flowing crazily and wantonly, rolling along that delicate skin. It was a bloody hand dripping with blood that would make anyone tremble in fear. The strong smell of blood instantly surged through the depths of the forest like a tide. "Brother Lu!" A clear call came from the ridge of the field. Lu Chen looked up and saw Exen standing there and waving at him with a smile. Lu Chen threw away the tools in his hand, clapped his hands to shake off the soil, and then walked over. He sat down on the edge of the field and said with a smile, "Why are you here?" Exen smiled and said, "I have nothing to do today, so I came over to have a look." Lu Chen curled his lips and sighed. "There's such a big gap between people. I, an errand disciple, work myself half to death at the foot of the mountain all day and still don't earn much. You, on the other hand, earn a lot of money every few days. It's just that the divine disc in your stomach has a few more pillars than mine." Xian was originally squatting beside him. Hearing this, her cheeks turned red. She hit Lu Chen and said, "You're talking nonsense again." Lu Chen laughed. Xian looked around and asked, "Hey, where's Atsu? Doesn't it usually follow you here?" Lu Chen also looked around. Although he didn't see Atsu, he calmly said to Exen, "That stupid dog can't stay still. It likes to run around, and it likes to hide in the forest. It probably ran into some forest again." "I see." Exen looked a little disappointed, but soon a trace of worry appeared on her face. She said to Lu Chen, "Brother Lu, Atsu just came here not long ago. This place is big, and there are forests and ravines everywhere. Will Atsu get lost?" Lu Chen waved his hand indifferently and said, "It's okay, you don't have to worry." Xian looked at Lu Chen helplessly. She didn't know why this brother Lu was so confident. Anyway, if it was her, she wouldn't be able to do it. But now that they couldn't find Atsu, she had no choice but to suppress the trace of worry in her heart and said to Lu Chen, "Brother Lu, have you thought about what you want me to do?" Lu Chen looked at the mountains in the distance. Without turning his head, he casually replied, "What is it?" Xian said, "Didn't you say last time that if you help me come up with an idea, I will promise to do one thing for you?" "Oh, that thing." Lu Chen seemed to have come to a realization. He turned to look at Xian with a relaxed expression and said with a smile, "Why, are you in a hurry?" Xian shook her head and said, "Of course I'm not in a hurry. But that thing, you really helped me a lot. I want to repay Brother Lu." Lu Chen said, "I haven't thought about it yet. Let's talk about it when I think about it." "Okay then." Xian seemed to feel a little sore in her legs after squatting for a long time. She directly landed on the ridge of the field beside Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at her and said, "Aren't you afraid of the soil?" Xian pursed her lips and said, "I'm not afraid. Back in the disorienting lands, I even rolled in the soil and water. Especially those insects' drugs, it's much dirtier than here." Lu Chen laughed. Xian glared at him and waited until he stopped laughing. She said to Lu Chen, "But I recently heard that Bai Chao Tang will be recruiting some people to do spiritual power cultivation. If they do well, they may not only get some opportunities, but they may also be able to leave this spiritual field at the foot of the mountain. I wonder if you're interested?" Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and looked at Xian with a trace of surprise. "You actually knew about this in advance?" Xian looked around. Seeing that there was no one nearby, she smiled slightly proudly and said to Lu Chen in a low voice, "Although our family has been average these years, there are always some brothers and uncles who have joined the Kunlun party. One of them is in Bai Chao Tang and has become a follower of immortal Qian Deng. So, are you interested?" Xian giggled as she looked at Lu Chen and said, "Those who do things like cultivating spiritual energy are either seniors, elders, or young and powerful geniuses in our sect. If they are fated, they will have great fortune in the future." Lu Chen looked at her for a moment and suddenly laughed. He nodded and said, "Yes, of course I'm interested. That promise." He pointed at Xian and nodded. "Help me with this." But Xian nodded with a smile. Deep in the woods, the bloody hand flitted across Atu's eyes slowly. The scarlet and terrifying color of blood was like a sharp knife, causing its pupils to contract uncontrollably. The extraordinarily beautiful girl was gently stroking the fur of Atsu's back with her delicate, snow-white left hand. Her right hand was dripping with blood, filling the air with a strong, pungent smell of blood. This strange scene was concentrated on her, making her look like a holy fairy, but also like a ferocious evil spirit. "Eat." Her deep and melodious voice reverberated through the forest. "You have the bloodline of the heavenly wolf. You were born to be different. How can ordinary food satisfy your appetite? Only blood, blood that contains spiritual power, is what you desire the most. Come eat." She slowly put her hand to the mouth of Atsu, with a strange smile on her face. She seemed to be looking forward to it but also sympathizing with it. Perhaps there was also a little desire. "Come taste this blood. As long as you have tasted it, one day, the blood in your body will awaken." Atsu's breathing slowly became louder. Its eyes seemed to be struggling in pain. It wanted to leave several times, but every time its eyes fell on the bloody hand again. After a while, Atsu's head slowly moved closer. It stuck out its tongue and gently licked the petite but demon-like bloody hand. The blood dispersed and melted into its mouth. The light in the woods quietly dimmed. Unknowingly, it was already dusk. Chapter 101. At dusk, when the sky was about to turn dark, the sunset glow was still hanging in the western sky, like a burning flame, radiating an unusually beautiful and brilliant afterglow. Stone Pan Valley was already a little dark, and most of the Oddjob disciples had already left. Lu Chen and Xian were still sitting on the edge of the field, looking at the deserted surroundings, but only the two of them were left. A long time had passed, and the sky was about to turn dark, but Atsu still hadn't come back. Xian was a little anxious, constantly looking around, and at the same time, glancing at Lu Chen from time to time. Lu Chen also frowned slightly, looking a little surprised. They waited like this for a while, watching the sky get darker and darker, and the last ray of the sun was about to disappear. The vast stone pan valley was about to be shrouded in darkness. Xianxia finally couldn't help but stand up and said to Lu Chen, "Brother Lu, let's go find Atsu?" Lu Chen frowned. "This valley is too big, and we don't know where that stupid dog went. Plus, it's dark, we can't find it." Suddenly Xianxia's eyes lit up and she said, "Could it be that Atsu ran back home by itself?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "It shouldn't be these days, it has been with me every day, and has never slipped away by itself." "Oh, what should we do?" Xianxia was anxious, and it seemed that she was really worried. Just as she was panicking, she suddenly heard Lu Chen, who was next to her, say, "Look over there." Xianxia looked in the direction that Lu Chen was pointing, and saw that on the other side of the field, on a path that had become very dark, suddenly a black shadow suddenly appeared, slowly walking out of the darkness, and then approached them. The black shadow was not tall. When it got closer, it really looked like But the strange thing was, Atu, who was usually lively and energetic, even though he was lame but still loved to run, was walking abnormally slowly at this time. Step by step, it stepped on the field embankment, and the darkness silently surged around it, as if it had become one with its black fur. Only its pair of eyes faintly glowed in the dark valley, and it seemed a little different from usual. Xianxia shouted with joy, and her previous worry suddenly disappeared. She walked towards the black dog with a smile, and at the same time, she opened her arms and said with a smile, "Stinky Atsu, I have been waiting for you for a long time today. Where did you go to play?" Atsu's footsteps slightly paused, and it slowly raised its head. When it saw Xianxia running towards it, it immediately stopped. Behind Xianxia, Lu Chen looked at Atsu's eyes, and then followed without saying a word. In the blink of an eye, Xianxia had already run to Atsu's side, squatted down, and first touched Atsu's head with her hand. Then, as usual, she touched the fur on Atsu's back with one hand, and held Atsu's head with the other, and played with it affectionately. Her white skin looked particularly beautiful and conspicuous in the night. Her slender neck and cheeks were right in front of Atsu's eyes, and from time to time, she even leaned on it, accompanied by her cheerful and crisp voice. It seemed so warm. Atsu's pair of eyes stared closely at Xianxia's neck, which was very close to it. Its mouth slightly opened and closed, as if it was panting. Gradually, it opened its mouth again, like a thirsty traveler seeing clear and sweet spring water in front of it. Its snow-white sharp fangs were shining at the edge of its mouth, giving off a sense of coldness. Its head faintly shrank back and then slowly stretched forward, as if responding to Xianxia's joyful hug, and slowly approached the girl's white neck. Sharp fangs and blood vessels that seemed like they could be broken with a single blow were very close. Suddenly, a hand suddenly stretched out from the dark shadow, passed through Xianxia's shoulder, and pressed down, covering the black dog's eyes. That pair of deep and serene eyes suddenly disappeared in the darkness of the night. Atsu's body suddenly shook, and its body trembled. The hair on its neck suddenly stood up, but it instantly calmed down. Everything happened so fast that it was almost invisible to the naked eye. In the blink of an eye, it quieted down again, standing still in the same place, letting Lu Chen's palm cover its eyes. "You stupid dog, where did you run off to?" Lu Chen laughed and scolded Atsu. His palm was still covering Atsu's eyes, and his body was also squatting beside Atsu, looking like he was covering Atsu's head. Then he turned his head and said to Xianxia with a smile, "But we are finally back. It's getting late and there will be curfew later. It seems that we won't be able to play today, let's go back." Xianxia hesitated for a moment, and then said with a smile, "Okay." As she said that, she touched Atsu's soft fur again, and said with a smile, "Atsu, listen to Brother Lu, I will come to play with you tomorrow, okay? But you can't just run out and come back so late again." Atsu stood still. Its eyes were still covered by Lu Chen's hand, and it remained silent. However, its mouth slightly opened and closed, and a dark light flashed past its sharp white fangs. "Don't worry, I will find a rope to tie it to a tree later, and see if it can still run away." Then don't." "Atsu is so pitiful," Xianxia immediately protested. Lu Chen smiled and nodded and said, "Up to you, I won't tie it up if you say so. Exen suddenly became happy. She nodded and smiled at Lu Chen, then patted Atsu's head again, and turned to walk away. After a few steps, she suddenly seemed to think of something and looked back. She saw that on the ridge of the field, Lu Chen was still gently pressing Atsu's eyes. A man and a dog were side by side, and their postures seemed a little strange. Brother Lu, why do you always cover Atsu's eyes? Xian asked loudly. Oh, this stupid dog is not obedient, I have to teach it a lesson. I will bring it back later, Lu Chen replied with a smile. Xian replied with an oh, turned around and continued to walk, and soon disappeared into the night. When the last remnant of the girl also disappeared, only Lu Chen and Atsu were left in the entire valley. At this time, the sky was completely dark and darkness spread from all directions, completely swallowing their figures. In the darkness, Atsu was still standing quietly, as if it was waiting for something. After a while, it suddenly felt that its eyes were loosened, and then the palm that was covering its eyes slowly moved away. The face of the man in the darkness appeared in front of it, like a shadow in the dark night, blurry and indistinct. There was only a pair of bright but stern eyes, staring coldly into Atsu's eyes. Between heaven and earth, suddenly, there was a cold wind blowing. It was bone-chilling, as if it could freeze and solidify blood. Atsu took a step back, then slowly, gently lowered its body to the ground, like an obedient subject, bowing its head in front of a powerful king. In its mouth, there was a low whimpering sound. Lu Chen stared at Atsu for a while, suddenly stood up, turned around, and walked away. At the same time, he said lightly, "It's late, let's go back." In a secluded valley, in a simple and deserted hut, Lu Chen lit a candle. The door was closed, and the window was tightly shut, so this lonely hut seemed to be isolated from the outside world, becoming a small world. Atsu was lying at Lu Chen's feet, looking a little sleepy and tired, but it didn't fall asleep. It put its head close to Lu Chen's ankle, slightly rubbing against it. Its long black tail would shake from time to time, but it was still unusually quiet. Lu Chen sat alone in silence for a long time, frowning slightly, as if he was thinking about something. After a long time, he suddenly bent down and sat directly on the ground. At the same time, he reached out and picked up Atsu, and put it on his feet. An inexplicable aura seemed to be faintly exuding from his body. Atsu twisted its body uneasily, but after glancing at the expressionless Lu Chen, it quickly calmed down and quietly lay in his arms. Lu Chen's eyes swept over Atsu's body, staying for a long time on its eyes, then suddenly reached out and opened Atsu's mouth. Snow-white sharp fangs were exposed in front of him, mixed with a faint, almost imperceptible smell of blood. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. He loosened his fingers, then pressed his palm on the fur of Atsu's body, and slowly touched down. Under the fur, the black dog's muscles bulged a little, wrapped around its bones, giving it a strange sense of power. When his hand slid across Atsu's chest, Lu Chen suddenly stopped. Through the muscles and fur, in the chest, there was a heart beating strongly. Strong, fast, and violent, beating far better than ordinary beasts, and far better than his usual self. There was a trace of haze in the depths of Lu Chen's eyes, but there was not much change in his expression. After feeling the strange heartbeat of Atsu for a while, his palm slid down again, touching the back of Atsu's back. Suddenly, there was a little moisture in his hand. Lu Chen looked down slightly, and saw a dark shadow between Atsu's black fur. It seemed to be the remnants of blood that had flowed through, emitting a subtle smell between the dry and bloody smell. Then, not far away, there was another similar small bloodstain. Lu Chen touched it bit by bit, and pieces of remnant traces gradually appeared on Atsu's fur. Some of them were attached to the surface, and some had penetrated deep into the skin. Then they converged together, and finally formed a shape. Lu Chen's expression turned cold for the first time, and his gaze was as cold as a knife. He looked at the thing that was formed by traces of blood on the back of the black dog in front of him. It was a handprint formed by blood. He suddenly covered it with his palm, and then found that the handprint seemed to be only half the size of his palm, as if it was a child's palm, stained with blood, and left this bloody handprint on Atsu's body. The night was getting darker, and suddenly, a cold wind blew by, abruptly knocking open the window of the house. The cold wind rushed in, and abruptly blew out the candle flame. The whole world suddenly turned dark. Chapter 102. In the dark, Lu Chen sat still, but Atsu suddenly stood up from the ground, stared at the window, and let out an angry roar. The cold wind blew past, and it was cold inside and outside the house. Inside the house, one couldn't even see their own fingers, and outside the house, there was a boundless black sea. Lu Chen lowered his head and saw a pair of green eyes right beside him in the darkness. They flickered with a strange luster, as if they were transparent and precious gems. At the same time, they also seemed to emit a cold and gloomy light. It was as if an evil spirit was silently staring at him. As if feeling his gaze, Atsu also withdrew its gaze and looked up at Lu Chen. The eyes of a man and a dog met in the air. After a while, Lu Chen reached out and gently touched Atsu's head and whispered, "It's okay." Atsu quieted down. Lu Chen stood up and walked to the window, looked outside, and then closed the window again without any expression. With a pa sound, the outside world was once again separated from here. The next day, the sun rose as usual, and the people in the mountains of Kunlun went about their own business as usual. Everyone lived according to their own path. As the lowest-rung disciples of the Kunlun party, they had their own lives, and that was to work hard every day to pursue the hope of becoming immortals in the future. Even if the hope was very slim, everyone in the world worked hard for that hope. The legendary stories of the lowest-rung disciples turning the tide and finally becoming saints and immortals were still passed down in the world today. After thousands of years, they still hadn't disappeared. Instead, they became more and more magnificent, inspiring generation after generation of rung disciples to dedicate their lives to this. When the sun shone on Shurpan Valley, Lu Chen also arrived with Atsu. There was no lack of people who came earlier than him, so at this moment, there were already figures working in the large spiritual fields. As for Xian, who vowed to come and play with them again yesterday, she was still nowhere to be seen. Maybe she was still sleeping in her warm bed. Compared with last night's abnormality, Atsu seemed to have completely recovered after a night's sleep. Following closely behind Lu Chen, it limped around, sniffed, and looked no different from usual. Lu Chen also acted as if nothing had happened last night. He calmly did his own things. After arriving at the spiritual field, he went down to the field and didn't pay much attention to Atsu. Of course, he didn't find a rope to tie Atsu to a tree like what he told Xian yesterday. In the beginning, Atsu was still playing around Lu Chen's spiritual field. However, after playing for a while, it became a little bored. After looking around for a while, it barked at Lu Chen twice. Lu Chen didn't look back as if he didn't hear it. Atsu hesitated for a while, then ran away by itself. Nowadays, Atsu was very familiar with the Shurpan Valley. The crisscrossed ridges of the fields were no problem for it. Soon, it ran out of the spiritual field and came to the edge of the forest. However, as it walked, the forest appeared in front of it again. It stood silently in front of the black dog. Atsu was obviously a little hesitant. After hesitating for a while, it lay down on the ground and stood up again. After walking a few rounds, it finally slowly walked into the forest. This forest was very cold. The deeper it went, the quieter it became. Gradually, it seemed that even the sound of birds could not be heard. The forest should be full of vitality, but for some reason, it gave people a sense of coldness and desolation. Atsu walked slowly, his pair of dog eyes looking around vigilantly, as if he was very careful. After walking for a while, it suddenly stopped and looked around. It found that this was the place where it met the mysterious little girl yesterday. Woof, 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 Atsu barked twice. A gentle breeze blew through the forest, and the green leaves swayed gently, but no one responded. Atsu waited for a while. It seemed to be a little confused, but it also seemed to be relieved. It turned around and was ready to leave. However, at this moment, a low laugh suddenly came from the depths of the forest. The voice was clear and melodious, like a wind chime gently swaying in the breeze. The person was not there, but it was already a beautiful picture. After a moment, the voice was soft, drifting with the wind. "Puppy, come." Atsu widened its eyes and looked at the dense trees in the depths of the forest. After a moment of hesitation, it still walked over. A few fresh green leaves that had yet to wither strangely fell from the tree overhead. The leaves swayed slightly, and a moment later, a beautiful and immature face of a little girl appeared from behind the leaves. She looked at Atsu with interest and giggled. Her eyes flashed with a strange light, like the eyes of a snake, beautiful and dangerous. Or, because of the danger, there was a strange beauty. Atsu suddenly stopped and raised its nose to sniff the air. There was the smell of blood. It was much stronger than yesterday. "You smell it?" The little girl looked at Atsu and smiled. Then she stretched out her white and tender left hand and waved at it. "Come here, I'll show you something." Atsu hesitated for a moment and stared at the little girl. For some reason, it did not continue to move forward. The girl seemed a little surprised. After thinking for a while, the smile on her lips seemed to be a little wider. She did not say anything more and just slowly pushed the branches and leaves in front of her. A blood-red light flashed in front of it in an instant, and the smell of blood in the air became thicker. "Come here, don't you like the smell of blood the most?" The beautiful girl's soft voice seemed to be inexplicably tempting. "Don't be afraid, you were born to drink blood. Come here, come here." Atsu's body began to tremble slowly, and its eyes flickered with a strange light. But at this moment, suddenly, on the other side of the forest, someone suddenly snorted. Suddenly, a black shadow flashed, like a ghost, and swept into the back of the forest in a blink of an eye. It was Lu Chen. A cry of surprise suddenly came from the back of the forest. Atsu was also stunned on the spot, as if it was dumbfounded for a moment. And in this short span of a few breaths, there was a series of muffled sounds. No one knew what was happening behind the thicket, but after a while, there was a sudden roar, and a large tree was directly snapped in half. The entire thicket came crashing down. The incomparably strong smell of blood instantly hit them in the face, and the dark red color soared into the air. On the ground behind the forest, there was an unrecognizable beast lying on the ground. At this moment, it was already dead. What was unbearable to look at was that the corpse was covered with cuts and bruises. No one knew how many wounds it had been cut, and blood flowed everywhere. Two figures turned over from behind the forest and entangled with each other. They suddenly started fighting fiercely. It was Lu Chen and the little girl who seemed to be just over 10 years old. What made one speechless was that in this small space, both of their moves were exceptionally vicious. Strangling the throat, gouging the eyes, hammering the chest and hitting the groin. Every move and every style were aimed at the vital parts of the body. But one by one they were neutralized by the opponent, and then they would be greeted with even tougher and more terrifying killing moves. This kind of fighting style completely lacked the elegance and nobility of a normal cultivator displaying their supernatural powers. There was not even the slightest bit of the legendary celestial bearing. How was this the Kunlun Mountains of a famous cultivation sect? This was clearly the most despicable and vicious killer in the mortal world. The most shocking thing was that the little girl was obviously very young, but she was so ferocious that it made people's hair stand on end. She was even no weaker than Lu Chen. But in the end, Lu Chen seemed to have the upper hand. It was not because of his viciousness and profound skills. But in this strange yet exceptionally dangerous close combat, the little girl's strength after sustaining for a while, finally weakened. The beast's blood stained their bodies, and even the girl's beautiful face was stained with blood, making her look even more ferocious and ferocious. She panted fiercely, both her hands were grabbed by Lu Chen. Suddenly she screamed and directly used her teeth to bite Lu Chen's throat. This time Lu Chen was caught unprepared. He groaned in pain and felt a burst of pain coming from his neck. With a roar, he suddenly lifted his leg and heavily kicked that girl's abdomen. The girl cried out involuntarily. Her entire body was sent flying by the impact, but she floated in the wind for a while. She trembled at first, but she quickly restrained herself. Like a feather, she landed directly on a tree trunk and then silently slid down. Like a ferocious cub. Her face was stained with blood, her eyes filled with murderous intent. Panting heavily, she coldly looked at Lu Chen. Lu Chen reached out and touched his neck. His hand was wet. When he put it in front of his eyes, half of his palm was covered in blood. He raised his head and glanced at the girl not far away. Then, without changing his expression, he tore off a piece of his robe, wrapped it around his neck, and tied a knot. "You're even fiercer than a dog," Lu Chen said. The girl narrowed her eyes slightly, and a dangerous light flashed in the depths of her eyes. Suddenly, her body shot out like a spring, but she did not pounce on Lu Chen. Instead, she strangely rushed towards the black dog standing on the side. The sound of the wind was fierce, and the momentum was like a knife, as if it would tear Atsu apart in the next moment. This caused the black dog's body to curl up and retreat in fear. At this moment, Lu Chen's figure suddenly cut in from the side. In an instant, he knocked away the terrifying girl in midair. At the same time, he shouted, "Run, Atsu!" Atsu was still in a state of shock. It subconsciously tucked its tail between its legs, turned around, and fled. In the blink of an eye, it had run far away and disappeared into the forest. However, perhaps because it was too panicked, the stupid dog ran in the wrong direction. Instead of running out of the forest, it rushed deeper into the forest. The figures in the air separated and landed on the ground. Both of them groaned in pain at the same time. Blood flowed from Lu Chen's neck again. The piece of cloth that had just been tied around his neck had disappeared, revealing the terrible wound. At the same time, there were 3 shocking claw marks. He had been attacked by the girl just now. After the girl landed on the ground, she staggered 3 steps back. Her beautiful eyebrows were tightly knitted together, and she sucked in a breath of cold air. She clutched her lower abdomen tightly with her hands. Between the gaps of her white, jade-like fingers, dark red blood slowly seeped out. Among the bloodstains under her clothes, there was a vague, bloody wound. It was a sword wound. It was a wound that had been ruthlessly stabbed by a sword. It was a merciless, murderous wound. In the midst of the blood, her face became pale. Chapter 103. She raised her head to look at Lu Chen, and finally her eyes fell on Lu Chen's hand. There seemed to be an afterimage of a black dagger passing by, and then quickly disappearing, as if it had always been empty. The girl's cheeks became increasingly pale, and more blood flowed out of her lower abdomen, dyeing her fingers red. Only her eyes were still sharp and fierce, with a trace of coldness, coldly looking at Lu Chen. After a moment, she suddenly opened her mouth and said, "I'm only 10 years old, and you actually dare to do this to me?" Lu Chen's expression did not change in the slightest and said, "I just don't want to die." "But," the girl sneered, "you're a man, yet you still have so many excuses to bully me. Do you really not feel embarrassed?" Lu Chen did not answer her, and after looking at her thoughtfully for a moment, he suddenly walked towards the girl. The girl suddenly seemed a little nervous, and her body shrank back a little, and suddenly shouted, "You can't kill me." Lu Chen stood in front of her, and looked at the girl whose height did not even reach his chest. For a moment, he also felt that it was unreal. No one would have thought that this girl, who was as beautiful as a fairy, would actually have such a dangerous and cruel side. The scene of seeing her at the Kunlun Mountain Gate that day flashed in his mind. Lu Chen's heart moved and he frowned. "Why? I have a great background. If you dare to touch me, you're dead." The girl fiercely threatened him. Lu Chen raised his eyebrows as if he was a little interested and said, "Oh, so powerful? Tell me." The girl seemed to hesitate for a moment, but glanced at Lu Chen's eyes that seemed to vaguely become a little cold, and hurriedly said, "I'm about to become Hakushin Jinkuin's 3rd pro-disciple." This time, Lu Chen was really shocked, and he couldn't help but size up the girl again. What kind of person was Hakushin Jinkuin? In the Kunlun party, he was a peerless master who stood side by side with Lord Tianlun. Even the current leader of the Kunlun party, Immortal Idol Month, was only his eldest disciple. Everyone knew that Hakushin Jinkuin only had 2 disciples. One was Zhenren Idol Month, and the other was Jin Dan Friar Zhuxian. In the past 60 years, no one in the Kunlun party had ever heard of Hakushin Jinkuin having the thought of accepting a disciple. That was a perfected cultivator of the soul formation level, the most powerful figure in the cultivation world of the Divine Land. A 10-year-old girl actually dared to say that she wanted to become a disciple of a true monarch? Lu Chen's first reaction was that the girl was lying. But soon he suddenly remembered a piece of news that old Ma had told him in private in Kunwa City that day. He frowned and took a step forward, almost within reach of her. He stared into the girl's eyes and said, "Could it be that you're the legendary genius of the 5 pillars that only appears once in 1,000 years?" The girl was startled. She seemed a little surprised, but then she said with a bit of arrogance, "Yes, it's me. Now you know that I didn't lie to you." Before she finished speaking, Lu Chen suddenly raised his hand and struck the back of the girl's head. Immediately, the girl's beautiful face turned pale. She let out a low groan and her body fell forward. Halfway through, she closed her eyes and fainted. Lu Chen reached out and hugged her. His brows were tightly knitted as he mumbled, "What the hell? Why am I so unlucky?" The black dog ran madly through the forest in a panic. Before he knew it, he had run far away. When he came back to his senses, he found that he was already on top of another mountain. This place was probably no longer within the boundaries of Stone Pan Valley. This mountain was also a bit different from the others. There were basically no tall trees on the mountain. Instead, most of the places were covered with verdant grass. In particular, the gentle slope at the foot of the mountain was covered with a large meadow. The mountain breeze blew and the grass rose and fell like waves. It was like a soft green carpet of grass. Anyone who saw it couldn't help but want to roll around on it. Atsu stood blankly at the foot of the mountain for a while. Then, it suddenly looked back and let out 2 soft barks. It seemed to be a bit hesitant, but in the end, it still turned around and walked back the way it came. Although the direction it went in seemed to be very dangerous, for it, there seemed to be something more important. It quietly overcame the fear in its heart and made it go back. But at this time, Atsu suddenly heard a mooing sound coming from the distance. To be exact, it came from the depths of the large meadow. It sounded a bit familiar. Atsu was stunned for a moment. It turned around and saw a huge figure lazily turning over in the thick grass. It raised a huge bull's head and glanced at Atsu. It was a huge oxen with 2 strange horns. "It's a small world, and we meet again after parting in the desolate valley." Atsu's eyeballs rolled around. Then, it barked at the oxen in the distance and ran over. Atsu ran to the meadow. When it got closer, it could feel the huge size of this oxen. It looked like a small mountain. At that moment, the green ox seemed to be basking in the sun. He had nothing to do and watched curiously as the black puppy ran all the way to him and started barking at him. Woof, woof woof, woof 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 woof. Atsu's tail kept wagging. It seemed to be very respectful and deliberately trying to please this green bull. Then, it seemed to be pleading. However, oxen had no reaction to this. After looking at Atsu for a moment, it lost interest and let out a mooing sound. Then, it closed its eyes again and seemed to be going back to sleep. Atsu became a little anxious, but it didn't dare to be disrespectful to this huge mythological beast. It anxiously paced around on the spot. Right at this moment, a figure suddenly appeared from behind oxen. It was the figure of a woman. She was tall and slender, and she was extremely beautiful. There was a beautiful scarlet feather shawl draped over her shoulders, and it was as if a beautiful fiery cloud had landed on her delicate shoulders. This woman was standing very close to Oxen, and one of her hands was even pressed against Oxen's body. However, Oxen didn't seem to be repulsed by this. It seemed to be treating this woman with special respect. After the woman walked out, there was no expression on her face. Little Qing doesn't like to meddle in other people's business. Don't bother it. Atsu stood rooted to the spot for a long time. It looked at the lazy oxen, then looked at the strange woman, as if it couldn't figure out the relationship between the two. However, it quickly remembered something more important. There was no help here, but there was someone more important to it in the forest at the foot of the mountain. Atsu let out a roar, and it seemed to be a little angry. It barked at the man and the cow before turning around and rushing down the mountain. Oxen didn't move in the slightest. Its eyes were closed, and it seemed that it was about to fall asleep. In contrast, the young woman standing beside Oxen suddenly furrowed her brows. She looked at the little black dog that was running for its life, and said, "There seems to be something wrong with this dog." Oxen's huge head turned around, and it rubbed the grass on the ground a few times. It yawned, and it still seemed to be disinterested. The young woman kept looking at the back of Atsu in the distance. After thinking for a moment, she said in a low voice, "There's a smell of blood." The grayish-white wall appeared in front of her, and it trembled. When she had just woken up, this was the feeling in front of her. After a while, the young woman regained consciousness. She turned her head with some difficulty, and then she saw the face of Lu Chen sitting by the bed. "You're awake." Lu Chen smiled at her, and nodded with a very gentle expression. The young woman was startled, and she let out a low groan, as if she was startled. She suddenly sat up, and wanted to hit him with a backhand. However, her body had only flipped for a moment, and she suddenly fell back down, falling onto the bed. Fortunately, her body was covered with soft bedding, and it didn't hurt much. The young woman gasped for breath, and then found that her hands and feet were tied, and she couldn't move. However, the bleeding wound on her lower abdomen had been bandaged, and there was a faint pain, and there was a burst of cool feeling on the wound. It seemed that some kind of medicine had been applied, and it felt pretty good. The young woman looked up at Lu Chen, and after staring at him for a moment, she said, "What do you mean?" Lu Chen sighed, and looked a little helpless, and said, "I've been thinking about how to deal with you." The young woman sneered and said, "What do you want?" Lu Chen stretched out 2 fingers and said, "There are 2 ways. First, I'll treat your injury, and when your injury is healed, we'll pretend that this never happened. Second, I'll just kill you." When the young woman heard the first way, her face was full of contempt, and her face was full of disdain, but when she heard the second way, she was shocked and said angrily, "How dare you? You dare to kill me?" Lu Chen said seriously, "I have no other way." The young woman became even angrier and said angrily, "What do you mean by no other way? Why do you have to kill me? I didn't provoke you. Don't tell me it's because I wanted to steal a few seed of asparagus from you in that broken shop a few days ago? I say, you look quite good, but how can you be so vicious?" Lu Chen said, "What you scolded me with just now, except for one thing, is wrong. I'm not that kind of person." The young woman stared at him, and after a moment she sneered, "You just said that you want to kill me. But tell me, what did I say just now?" Lu Chen coughed and said, "That shop is indeed a broken shop. There's no other way. The shop owner is stupid. As for the rest, I won't admit it." The young woman snorted, looking like she obviously didn't believe him, but after these words, the atmosphere between the two eased up a bit. After a while, the young woman thought for a moment and said, "I've already told you my identity. If you're not afraid of angering true monarch, then go ahead and harm me." Lu Chen said, "I don't want to harm you." The young woman raised her hand, looked at the rope and sneered, "Then why are you tying me up?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and stared at her eyes and said, "I don't want to provoke Hakushin Jinkuen, so I can let you go. But you have to tell me, at such a young age, where did you learn these killing skills?" Chapter 104. I don't have the ability to kill people. The little girl flatly denied and sneered, "Go out and ask around. I'm a girl who grew up in Kunwa cities by clan. I'm pure, upright, dignified, gentle, and lovable. It would be strange if anyone would believe your words." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then said, "You're more powerful than I thought." After a pause, he said, "By clan's member?" "White Lotus." The girl glanced at him and asked, "What about you?" Lu Chen. White Lotus, who was born with a devastatingly beautiful face at such a young age, sized up Lu Chen with her bright eyes, then looked around the room and said, "You're still a part-time disciple?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "My aptitude isn't good. I've made a fool of myself." White Lotus seemed to be a bit young after all. After hearing this compliment, a complacent expression appeared on her face. But very soon, her face suddenly darkened, and she spat and said, "You can still catch me with your aptitude? You're beating around the bush to scold me." Lu Chen smiled and shook his head, not saying anything. White Lotus rolled her eyes and suddenly looked at him with interest. She said, Speaking of which, how can a part-time disciple have such messy abilities? What's your background? Lu Chen said, I used to kill pigs. I've seen blood and fought before. Later, I felt that killing pigs was boring, so I wanted to become an immortal and gain the Tao. That's why I went through untold hardships to come to the Kunlun party. Butcher. The smile on White Lotus's face suddenly froze. As Lu Chen spoke, although he looked relaxed on the surface, his mind was spinning rapidly. This girl, White Lotus, was obviously a huge trouble. If he didn't handle it carefully, it could bring about endless troubles in the future. Thinking of this, even he, who was always calm, couldn't help but complain in his heart. He thought to himself, nowadays even a 10-year-old girl is so scary. What will happen when she grows up? At this moment, the two of them suddenly heard a rustling sound coming from the door. White Lotus's eyes lit up, but Lu Chen stood up calmly and walked to the door to open it. A black shadow darted in with a swoosh. It was Black Dog. As soon as it came in, it intimately rubbed against Lu Chen's side and wagged its tail with all its might, looking like it was flattering Lu Chen. Lu Chen closed the door and scolded with a smile, Don't pretend to be stupid. I still remember how you abandoned me and ran away by yourself. Atsu suddenly let out a low whimper, looking a little sad. But at this moment, a sneer suddenly came from the other side of the bed. It was White Lotus who was lying there and sneered, Who's pretending? I clearly remember that you told this black dog to run away first, and now you're blaming the dog? Can't you have a conscience when you speak, uncle? Uncle? Lu Chen's face darkened, but before he could retort, Atu had already turned around to look at the young girl lying on the bed. He immediately let out an angry roar as the hair on his neck stood on end. He bared his teeth and roared fiercely at Bai Lian. It looked like he was about to rush up and bite her if he didn't agree with him. Uncle? Lu Chen's expression darkened. White Lotus, however, was not afraid at all. She looked at Atsu and sneered, Stupid dog, if you bark at me again, I'll skin you. Atsu was getting more and more annoyed, but it seemed that it was really a little afraid of White Lotus. It barked repeatedly, but it stayed at the feet of Lu Chen and did not rush forward even half a step. Lu Chen kicked Atsu's butt and scolded, Idiot, she's tied up by me. What are you afraid of? Atsu stared at White Lotus. Sure enough, it saw that White Lotus was lying on the bed with her hands and feet tied up. It suddenly became excited and rushed over with a loud bark. It rushed in front of White Lotus like a wolf or a tiger, opened its big mouth and bit randomly in the air, threatening her. White Lotus was so angry that her little face turned pale. She blocked a few times with her hands and then said angrily, Stupid dog, you're really as heartless as your master. Did you forget that I gave you your favorite thing? Atu whimpered a couple of times. It looked like it couldn't understand human language anymore, but it still managed to sneak a peek at Lu Chen from the corner of its eyes as it bared its fangs. Lu Chen walked over and said with a slight frown, By the way, this is also something I want to ask you. How do you know about blood food? White Lotus' face suddenly changed, but then she snorted and turned her head away. She had a look of, I don't understand what you're talking about, and I'm too lazy to say more. Lu Chen's face darkened and said indifferently, Blood food is a secret method passed down from generation to generation in the southern barbarians. Only the great shamans and priests can practice this method, and it has never been passed down in the Central Plains. Do you know that once I report this matter, you may be directly burned to death in front of this Kunlun mountain, not to mention becoming a disciple of a true monarch? White Lotus' face changed several times in a row. She turned her head to look at Lu Chen, and her eyes became cold. She said, You're just a butcher, how do you know so much? How many secrets do you have in secret? I don't think I need to tell you. A janitor disciple with ruthless means, astonishing strength, and knowing so many secrets. If I were to say, you might even be a spy of the evil sect. If we really shed all pretense of cordiality, do you believe that you won't be able to live? Lu Chen lowered his head slightly. After a moment, he shook his head and said slowly, I'm not a spy of the evil sect. Who would believe that? White Lotus sneered and said. She stared at Lu Chen, her eyes as cold as a snake. There was a short silence in the room. For a moment, no one spoke. But both sides were still staring at each other. No one was willing to step back. The atmosphere became somewhat tense. Atsu was still fiercely baring its fangs at the side. But after baring its fangs for a long time and almost dripped its saliva onto the bed, Atsu suddenly realized that the other two people didn't seem to have the intention to look at it. The two of them stared at each other, threatening each other with their fiercest eyes. From Atsu's point of view, it seemed that these two humans were angrily competing whose eyes could stare wider and whose eyes could last longer without blinking. Atsu suddenly felt a little embarrassed. It awkwardly closed its mouth and swallowed its saliva. Then, looking at the two people who were staring at each other, it decided to help its master. Woof 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 woof. The black dog suddenly roared. Then, it jumped up and opened its big mouth to bite down on White Lotus's face. Lu Chen and White Lotus, who were confronting each other and trying to overwhelm each other's imposing manner, were startled at the same time. White Lotus cried out in alarm and subconsciously leaned to the side. But Atsu was very close to her, so how could she dodge in such a hurry? In a moment of desperation, White Lotus's complexion suddenly darkened. Her bound wrists suddenly leaned against her chest as if she had grabbed something. On the side, Lu Chen's heart stirred. He hastily shouted, "Atsu, don't act recklessly." For a proud daughter of heaven like White Lotus, no matter how she behaved in private, she was, after all, the daughter of an influential family in Kanwa City. Moreover, she was destined to become Hakushin Jinkuin's disciple. It would be strange if a person with such an identity didn't have any life-saving trump cards. But in that split second, Atsu's body paused for a moment. All of a sudden, an emerald green light shone out from White Lotus's chest and fell on Atsu's body. Atsu's body suddenly stopped in midair. It didn't go up nor go down, just hovering in the air a few feet above the ground. The inexplicable black dog was somewhat puzzled and afraid. Its ferocious appearance disappeared, and it looked around for a moment before barking at Lu Chen. Lu Chen's complexion changed when the green light shot out, but then he felt that the power within it wasn't fierce and it didn't have any killing intent, so his expression relaxed a little. At this moment he shook his head and no longer cared about Atsu. Instead, he turned to White Lotus and said, "I don't care what you think. In short, from the beginning, I didn't take the initiative to cause trouble for you. Since both of us have some unspeakable secrets, I think we might as well shake hands and make up. What do you think?" White Lotus's pair of bright eyes stared at Lu Chen, as if trying to see through the heart of the man in front of her. After a moment, she suddenly sneered and said, "Don't just say nice things, let me go first." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Of course, but with your life-saving skills, this bit of rope shouldn't be able to trap you." White Lotus smiled and said, "Uncle, I can't tell, you're almost a demon." As she said that, the green light in front of her suddenly flashed, and Atsu was bounced out and fell on the ground beside the bed. Then the green light slightly sank, flashed past her hands and feet, and the ropes immediately broke. White Lotus rubbed her wrist and sat up, then looked at Lu Chen with a smile that was not a smile and said, "Then let's have a good chat now?" Lu Chen looked at the green light that was still flashing incessantly in front of her chest, nodded and said, "Sure, but you put this thing away first." White Lotus snorted and said, "I'll put it away. Who knows if you will suddenly get greedy and try to harm me again." Lu Chen said, "If I want to harm you, just now when you weren't awake, I have already done it countless times." White Lotus's cheeks turned slightly red, glared at him and said, "Already so old, fighting with a little girl like me and still using underhanded methods to plot against me, don't you have any shame?" Lu Chen closed his eyes, shook his head and pretended not to hear. After a sigh, he said, "Quickly put it away." White Lotus took a deep breath, turned her wrist, the green light flashed and slowly retracted back into her palm. Lu Chen looked at the green light with some curiosity and said, "I have never heard of such a treasure before. It seems to be incomparably rich in wood spiritual qi. Is it some kind of wood heavenly treasure?" White Lotus didn't pay attention to him, probably because she didn't want to reveal the secret. The green light in her palm flickered, wavering non-stop. Lu Chen waited for a while, but saw that the green light didn't seem to retract much. He couldn't help but said, "Hey, do you still want to talk or not? Why did you take so long to retract this thing?" before he finished speaking, he suddenly heard White Lotus cry out in alarm. Her face instantly turned pale, and she said involuntarily, "No, why can't I control it?" Lu Chen's heart jumped. He suddenly looked up, only to see that the green light suddenly burst out in White Lotus's palm. The light was so bright that he could even faintly hear a terrifying whistling sound, like a violent wind passing by. After a moment, a green light suddenly rushed out, like a sharp sword. It directly pierced into Lu Chen's heart. Chapter 105. Lu Chen's first reaction was that this little girl, White Lotus, was really vicious and ruthless, not forgetting to silence people at all times. This kind of ferocious temperament, it was really the first time he had seen in his life. Most likely even the evil faction people could not compare to her. But in that split second, he saw that White Lotus's face was indeed filled with fear, and her entire body was suddenly wrapped by the bright green light, and then inexplicably floated up, letting out a scream. The green light that tore through the air was like an unstoppable tidal wave. Its speed was as fast as lightning, and it instantly filled the small house. Lu Chen had almost no time to react. With a loud bang, the emerald green light beam that seemed to be solid heavily hit his chest. Lu Chen's entire body shook, a muffled sound, his entire body flew out, hit the wall behind him, a trace of blood flowed down from the corner of his mouth. But very quickly, he seemed to feel something, his expression changed greatly, looked down at his chest. That emerald green light beam shone straight on his chest, in the depths of the light, to be exact, in his chest cavity, in his heart where blood was boiling, a gentle white light, in that intense green light, quietly emitted out, like in a vast sea of raging waves, there was a pure white flower towering majestically. But in the next moment, all the green light suddenly became 30% more intense, as if it had been stimulated by something. It expanded crazily and surged toward Lu Chen's chest from all directions. Wherever the light passed, the tables, chairs, and beds all floated up, and then were twisted and broken by a violent force. The room was in a mess, and even the surrounding walls were trembling slightly. It looked like the room was about to collapse. Lu Chen felt as if all the blood and flesh in his body were boiling. His face contorted as he howled in pain. He suddenly raised his head and roared at the White Lotus in front of him, "Quickly suppress this light, or we'll all die." But after he shouted, he found that the girl in front of him, White Lotus, was still floating in midair, but her black hair was fluttering, and her eyes were closed. He did not know when she had fainted. Not far from her, the black dog was also swept up by the strange green light. It spun around in the air and barked a few times in panic. Suddenly, its head tilted to one side and it seemed to have lost consciousness. The surging power was like a tide, crazily surging towards Lu Chen. In that instant, Lu Chen felt as if his entire body was about to fall apart. At this critical moment, he forcefully endured the intense pain, suddenly gritted his teeth, and with a low growl, he desperately used his hand to press against his chest. The gentle light in the depths of the green light seemed to be flickering in his palm, wind, and fingertips. In the next moment, all the power suddenly came to a halt. It was as if the world had gone silent and time had frozen. The green light was like solidified green ice, flashing a strange light in the air. The man and the dog who were floating in the air were frozen for a moment. Then, after that moment, everything disappeared with a loud bang. The light dissipated with a roar, the figure disappeared into thin air, everything returned to nothingness. In the small hut, like a whirlwind sweeping away the clouds, everything disappeared. Green light, Lu Chen, White Lotus, and even Atsu, in the blink of an eye, all disappeared. Only the garbage fragments that were originally blown into the air suddenly lost their support, and then like rain, they fell to the ground, a mess. After an unknown period of time, Lu Chen suddenly felt a warm and moist feeling on his face. He shook his head, feeling that his eyes and ears had not calmed down, it was still a mess. He closed his eyes and rested for a while, that strange feeling slowly receded, and then he opened his eyes. A tongue licked him next to him, a low whining sound came, it was Atsu's voice. Lu Chen took a deep breath, smiled at Atsu, and then sat up. When his body was only halfway up, he sucked in a breath of cold air, and almost fell down again. He quickly used his hands to support himself on the ground, and only then did he stabilize his body. At this moment, he only felt a strong pain coming from many parts of his body, especially his chest, which was the most uncomfortable. He touched the position of his chest with his hand, but found that there was actually no wound there. It seemed that the feeling just now was just an illusion. Lu Chen calmed himself down, then turned his head to look around. At this moment, he was in the mysterious tree hole-like space that he entered a long time ago. The ancient and mottled tree wall stood silently with the misty green air, and in the center of this tree hole, the puddle was still there. The water was clear and transparent, but it was no longer full of vitality. If one took a closer look, they would notice that there was a tiny and dark shadow hiding in the clear water somewhere in the depths of the water. It was like a dark flame, quietly burning. On the other side of the puddle, there was another petite figure lying on the ground 3 feet away. It was White Lotus. But at this moment she was lying there with her eyes closed, her face slightly pale, and she was motionless for a long time, as if she was still in a coma. Lu Chen frowned, withdrew his gaze, and glanced at Atsu beside him, only to find that both he and White Lotus did not seem to be in a good condition. Only Atsu did not know why. After the torment just now, at this moment, it seemed like nothing had happened, walking back and forth freely beside him, and at the same time, looking curiously at the small world in the tree hole that he had never seen before. It seems that you are the first to wake up. Lu Chen touched Atsu's head. Atsu grinned, and seemed to be in a good mood. Lu Chen smiled, then slowly stood up and carefully examined his body. Except for some pain all over his body, there did not seem to be any particularly serious injuries. Only then did he feel relieved. But at the same time, looking at the surrounding tree hole, he also frowned. This tree hole, especially the mysterious puddle in the tree hole, was the key to him being able to survive the incomparably vicious black flame curse. It was the strange surging vitality in the water that suppressed the terrible black flame again and again, including 10 years later when he made his last attempt against the black flame curse, once again maintaining his vitality. In the past 10 years, only he had entered this place and only he knew about it. Even old Ma knew nothing about it. This was because this mysterious tree hole was actually the mysterious and unfathomable seed he had obtained from the blazing heavenly light during the Battle of the Desolate Valley back then. This seed was undoubtedly extremely important. Not to mention anything else, just by looking at the God-vanquishing curse formation that the devil cult cast back then, it used this strange seed as the core weight, and thus caused a phenomenon of heaven and earth, attracting and controlling unimaginable power of heaven and earth. One could tell how powerful it was. At the end of the Battle of the Desolate Valley, He Lang had obtained it. Then, under some strange circumstances, the seed had actually silently hidden itself in his body. To be precise, it had somehow penetrated deep into his heart. It was also from then on that the seed seemed to have merged with Lu Chen, and Lu Chen soon discovered that there was another strange space in this seemingly small seed, and he could actually enter and exit this mysterious tree hole in that feeling of flesh and blood connection. At the same time, he found the life-saving spiritual water of life in the tree hole. Over the past 10 years, it was all thanks to this seed and the mysterious tree hole that Lu Chen was able to barely survive, even though he had still endured unimaginable pain along the way. However, when he fought against the Black Flame Curse in Qingshiteng village, he was lucky to survive, but he had already used up all the spiritual water of life. From then on, he rarely entered this mysterious tree hole. This was because in the past 10 years, he had of course explored this tree hole countless times. Every inch of the ground, every inch of the tree bark, including the hazy green gas, he had carefully explored it all. However, the disappointing thing was that apart from the amazing spiritual water of life in the puddle, he had not found anything else in this tree hole. It seemed like this was just a space that contained the spiritual water of life. Even so, it was actually quite amazing. Lu Chen was not a greedy person, so after his fruitless exploration, he did not continue. Until today, when the green light suddenly brought him, White Lotus, and Atsu into this place. Green light. Lu Chen suddenly raised his eyebrows and suddenly turned around, his eyes bright as he looked at White Lotus, who was still unconscious on the ground. Walking around the puddle, Lu Chen slowly walked to White Lotus's side and then squatted down. His gaze lingered on White Lotus's young but beautiful face for a moment. She was still unconscious and looked like she was asleep. At this moment, she was so quiet that she was like an ordinary girl. The inexplicable fragrance of innocence was like a flower that had just bloomed, and there was a breathtaking beauty about her. Some of her black hair slid down from her temples and rested on her gentle and fair cheeks. The little girl seemed to be dreaming of something. There was no longer any pain, anger, or viciousness on her face. The corners of her mouth were slightly pursed, as if she was smiling. That smile was so sweet. Could it be that she was dreaming of the person she loved the most? Lu Chen had never seen a person's temperament change so much when they were asleep. However, he quickly thought of something else. When White Lotus was awake in front of others, she seemed to have the temperament of a cold fairy. This little 10-year-old girl, how could she have so many different faces? Which one was the real one? Lu Chen silently stared at her beautiful face for a moment, then his gaze moved down to White Lotus's chest. Under the corner of her clothes, there was a soft but green radiance quietly flashing. Chapter 106. The faint light under the lapel was extremely green. It looked as if it was real, like the greenest and most crystalline jade. It was obviously of the same origin as the green light that had suddenly erupted before, but the difference in power was like heaven and earth. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and lifted the corner of the lapel. Sure enough, on the girl's snow-white neck, there was a pendant hanging on a thin string. It was shaped like a bamboo branch, and it was as thick as a thumb. It was green all over, and it was full of spiritual energy in the light. It was hard to imagine that the violent scene that had suddenly appeared was caused by this warm, jade-green object. But all of this was not important. The most important thing was that Lu Chen clearly remembered that this green twig pendant actually resonated with the seed in his body before, and it was precisely because of this that all kinds of strange phenomena occurred. In the end, it directly rushed into this mysterious tree hole with 2 people and a dog. This green twig must have a great relationship with this seed. Lu Chen stared at this beautiful jade-like twig, and his eyes became brighter and brighter. Atsu wandered around Lu Chen, curiously looking at the unconscious White Lotus lying on the ground. From time to time, it turned its head to look at Lu Chen. However, after seeing that Lu Chen did not move, Atsu felt a little bored. It turned its head to look around, and looked at the surrounding tree walls with interest. It observed the places where the roots of the gullies were, wondering if it should run over there and pee later to show that this place also belonged to it, Atsu. At this moment, Atsu suddenly heard Lu Chen's voice. It sounded a little low and somewhat inexplicable, as if there was a trace of a sigh. He said, "A twig, 2 leaves, and a seed. I didn't expect it to be true." Atsu poked his head over and glanced at Lu Chen. Lu Chen smiled and stroked its head, but his eyes were still staring at that emerald green branch. He said, "I originally thought that the people in the evil faction were all crazy, and I also thought that what they said was all crazy talk. That legendary divine tree that can connect the 3 worlds was even more so their crazy ravings." He smiled, perhaps with a hint of mockery, lightly said, "1 branch, 2 leaves, 1 seed. This is the only thing left in our world when the tree of God was destroyed in the ancient times in the myths of the evil cult. The story also clearly states that as long as these 4 divine items are gathered, the divine tree will be reborn and the 3 realms will be unified. The one that resonated with the seed should be the only branch of the divine tree in this world." Atsu waited for a while, seeing that Lu Chen was still deep in thought. It walked away alone and came to the strange wooden walls at the edge of the tree hole. It started to sniff and search for something. But it had only walked a few steps when it suddenly heard Lu Chen's voice behind it. "Atsu, don't pee. There's no ventilation here, it will stink to death." Atsu turned around and barked at Lu Chen. He looked a little dissatisfied, but he still walked back. He looked back at the wall of trees as if he was reluctant to part with them, as if he was regretful. Lu Chen did not pay attention to that somewhat resentful stupid dog. His eyes were still focused on that emerald green branch in front of him. After a moment, he stretched out his fingers and grabbed the branch, then slowly clenched it. In the tree hole, there seemed to be a moment of silence. Suddenly, a light lit up, a green light shone out from the gap between his fingers, followed by another, one after another, from every gap in his palm tenaciously emitted dark green light. That light was slightly trembling. A moment later, an abnormally strong aroma abruptly spread out. From Lu Chen's palm, from his clenched fist, from every crack, an incomparably viscous green liquid suddenly flowed out. Lu Chen stared at this green water, watching it slowly flowing along his palm, then dripping down and floating in the air. The tree hole that had been silent for countless years at this moment suddenly seemed to let out a deep sigh, like a traveler who had been starving for a long time, trembling slightly because of joy. Those misty green gas began to quickly flow up the tree wall, flashing, letting the dark green liquid float in the air, and then at a speed visible to the naked eye, little by little turned into incomparably fine powder, floating to every corner of the tree hole. With the wind dancing, the green turned into waves, spinning on their own, like a heavy rain that had been waiting for thousands of years, like a date that had been late for thousands of years, finally meeting. Lu Chen and Atsu stood on the ground in a daze, watching this magnificent and incomparably strange scene. Green drowned everything. It was like a flood in ancient times. All the fine powder rushed towards the tree wall. In the blink of an eye it covered every place, turning this ancient tree hole into a green world. But very quickly, the green powder seemed to fuse with the tree wall, quickly disappearing. Boom! From the silence, suddenly a roar sounded, as if it came from the deepest part of this ancient tree hole. Lu Chen suddenly looked up, only to see the tree wall around the tree hole becoming blurry in an instant. The green light frantically flickered, and then, suddenly the world became pitch black. The surroundings were empty. He seemed to suddenly be in a dark and boundless void. Above and below, left and right, there was only boundless darkness. There was no sky and no earth. Even his body seemed to have lost all its strength, floating emptily in the darkness. Specks of light suddenly lit up from afar. There were also sounds of woof 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 woof. It seemed to be Atsu's voice, with a hint of panic and doubt. Lu Chen looked up, only to see a head full of stars. Looking down, it was still the same. His body seemed to be constantly floating, completely out of control, drifting aimlessly in this magical void, until suddenly the emerald green light lit up again. The light abruptly pierced through the darkness and blossomed into an indescribable brilliance in the void. Then, from the depths of the emerald light cluster, countless rays of light that looked like strange roots suddenly extended out, shattering the seemingly solid darkness. Like tree roots, they extended into this dark world. Then the light shone brightly, like a violent sun suddenly appeared in front of him, radiating thousands of rays of light. At that moment, it was as if all the stars in the sky had lost their luster. The light dimmed slightly, there was a wind blowing, the whistling sound between heaven and earth faintly came, like a desolate ancient song from ancient times, faintly narrating the past. A door formed by the emerald green light suddenly appeared in front of him. After a moment, the green light suddenly soared, passed through his body and gathered again. Lu Chen looked back, only to see that behind him, a similar emerald green door had formed. The green light was bright, as if there was a surging life aura, dispersing all the darkness. The light flickered, everything seemed to have turned into a dark green ocean, but after a moment, suddenly everything in front of him disappeared, like a dream shattered in front of him, turning into endless dust. Lu Chen found himself once again in the tree hole, still standing in the same place. Those bright and dazzling green light, at this moment had completely dissipated. There was no longer any trace of it. The ancient tree hole seemed to have once again returned to its original state. But if one looked closely, one could still see that on the ancient mottled tree wall, there was suddenly a lot more vitality, and even the strange green gas that entangled inside and outside the tree wall, at this moment the color had deepened a lot. But what surprised Lu Chen the most was that on the two sides of the tree wall, behind the hazy gas, there suddenly appeared the outline of two doors. They were not really two doors, but only the vague outline of two doors. At the same time, most of them were covered by the ancient tree wall and the moving gas. Lu Chen tried to touch it, but found that it was like the moon in the water. He could only vaguely see it. When he really wanted to touch it, he could not feel it no matter what. These two doors, were they real doors? If they were doors, then where did they lead to? Lu Chen silently pondered for a moment, then looked back, only to see that White Lotus was still lying unconscious on the ground. For some reason, it seemed that when the green light resonated with the seed, a powerful force burst out. It had a particularly great impact on her, so until now, she still could not wake up. Lu Chen walked back to her side. After checking, his brows quickly wrinkled, because he found that the girl's breathing was suddenly becoming slower, and the interval between breaths was getting longer and longer, like some kind of monster hibernating in the mud cave in the cold winter. But people can't hibernate. Lu Chen touched her hand. It was cold to the touch. Without any hesitation, Lu Chen immediately sat down, then called Atsu, who was standing on the side, and let it lie beside him. At the same time, he held White Lotus in his arms, and his other hand grabbed Atsu. Before he moved, his eyes glanced at White Lotus's chest, and suddenly he was startled. He saw that the pendant she was wearing was still as green as usual, but for some reason, the original vitality had weakened by more than half. He looked at the emerald green branch, then closed his eyes, suddenly let out a low shout. His hands suddenly hugged White Lotus and Atsu tightly. There seemed to be a loud bang in their ears. At that moment, they seemed to have passed through countless miles. It seemed like a long time, but it also seemed like the blink of an eye. Suddenly, the two of them appeared out of thin air in that messy hut. Bang! They fell from midair. Atsu quivered, jumped up as if it had been electrocuted, shook its head and wagged its tail, looking very excited, very happy that it finally returned to this familiar world. And Lu Chen turned his head to look at White Lotus. After seeing her breath stop for a moment, then began to return to normal, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. She didn't seem to be very used to that tree hole, Lu Chen muttered in his heart. Then his eyes once again fell on the emerald green pendant on White Lotus's chest. His brows wrinkled again, feeling a little troublesome in his heart. At this moment, White Lotus's body moved. It looked like she was about to wake up. Lu Chen's eyebrows twitched, his mind turned quickly, countless thoughts surged in his mind in an instant. Suddenly, he stretched out his hand and tore off the clothes covering his chest. Then, the black sword suddenly appeared in his hand. With a flip of his hand, he directly stabbed the flesh on his chest a few times. Immediately, blood flowed out, and for a moment his flesh was badly mutilated. Lu Chen groaned in pain, but the next moment he turned his palm over, the black sword immediately disappeared. His body swayed a little, his face suddenly became pale, as if half of the blood in his body had flowed out from the wound. He suddenly fell to the ground, slamming heavily. After a moment, this sound seemed to startle White Lotus. She was a little dazed, opened her eyes, then her body immediately shook. Seeing not far from her, Lu Chen fell to the ground, body twitching uncontrollably. Suddenly she was shocked, couldn't help but sit up and asked in shock, "What's wrong with you?" Lu Chen covered his wound, his face twisted in pain, looking at the unusually beautiful girl in front of him. Even his voice became hoarse. "I didn't expect you to be such a woman, wanting to kill me just because of a disagreement." That you're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.